Welcome to the Westside King's Church podcast, a time where outside of Sundays we continue to wrestle with how the surprising grace of Jesus affects our everyday lives. So David, we're now coming out of Good Friday. Obviously a conversation around the cross, and I think, this is a heavy conversation. This is one that you can't cover everything theologically when it comes to the cross and how it works, and all of the history of it and all of those things in a short time frame. So we're going to have a little bit of a longer conversation around it because I think this is an important conversation to have. I think, again, as we've talked about expectations kind of along the way throughout Easter, we expect the cross does a certain thing based on some of our limited understanding, but there's so much more going on when it comes to the significance of the cross, the history of the cross, the theology of the cross, the social and kind of cultural implications of the cross that are happening that we can sometimes miss if we don't slow down and say, actually, let's take a long moment. Let's not rush through the cross and jump to Resurrection Sunday. As much as exciting as that is and as great as that is and significant, it's easy to skip over the cross and its significance. Maybe we start with a bit of the history, some of that stuff. We'll work our way through this. What are you're the Paul expert who loves to talk about a lot of the theology of Jesus and the cross. And why don't you kick us off and work through and back the train up to say, okay, you've given the Good Friday, but let's back that up and have a conversation about what's really happening around the cross.
Yeah, okay, so this is going to be hopeful. It's going to be fun for us, right? So let's hope this is kind of fun is maybe a weird word to use, I suppose, in that context. But so what I've wanted to do for a while is have a kind of longer conversation around this subject. We've taught series over the last few years on the cross, but you're always battling time. My suspicion is even in this podcast, we're going to be battling time.
Right.
So, there's a sense of Jürgen Moltmann has this great quote where he says the cross resists interpretation, right? So the problem is no matter what sort of interpretation we try and give for the cross, there's always something you're leaving out. So there's questions then for me about what might we be leaving out that we really can't afford to leave out? What do we need to think about? What's going on? I think I think it's worth us talking about history. I think it's worth us talking about theology. I think it's worth us talking about the social cultural implications and background of the cross. But I want to start where I think you always should start when talking about this subject. And that's with a few comments about its centrality. As where does the cross fit really in our sort of culture and context as Christians, obviously. So Martin Luther had this Latin phrase. The phrase is, I'll give it to you in Latin, not to sound pretentious, but because I think there's two ways to understand it, right? So the Latin phrase was crux probat omnia, right? Now crux, it means cross, omnia, omni, everything, and probat means, like, it's sometimes translated as the cross is the test of everything, right? But it could also be translated as the cross kind of proves everything, which kind of ties into a lot of the conversations that you and I have had over the a long period of time, that there's one thing that everything in the world, then this would be a very biblical position on the cross, is going to be tested by the cross. Is this true or false? Well, the cross might be the factor that decides that. But then, so the other side of it is the cross proves things. So what I think you do when you start to have a serious conversation around the cross as Christians is you start to ask questions about, does the cross hold this sort of position in my life? So there's almost a question of what's going on with the cross. And maybe a question that Christians don't ask often enough is, why is the cross so important to us? Everybody kind of picks up very quickly engaging with Christianity. The cross is important.
Yeah.
But why, right? And is it important as in it just fits into one part of our lives, right? So, thank you, Jesus, for the cross because you've saved me from my sins.
Yeah.
Right? Is that the full extent of what the cross is doing? Or have we narrowed the cross down to fit into the place in our life that we want the cross to fit.
Right.
So when somebody like Luther comes along and says, well, the cross tests everything, or the cross proves everything, you think, wow, his landscape of what the cross is doing must be much, much bigger than mine, because I'm not sure I'm seeing the cross as the test of everything. You know, does it test the way that I live, the way that I think, the worldview that I hold, what I do with my finance, how I raise my children, the places that I might work, you know, all these sort of things.
Yeah.
Are they all being tested and proved by the cross?
Yeah.
So I want to kind of think a little bit about that. There's an intro, you know. What do you want to talk about? Well, if the cross proves everything, maybe we need to talk about everything, right?
Yeah, so we'll be here for a while.
Yeah. So this could be some time. Also, of course, we're Christians, and Christianity is a religion of crosses. You know, so you can't escape crosses in Christianity. You walk into a church, there's invariably one somewhere. You know, we're recording this during Easter week. It's, you know, there's crosses everywhere. We're very focused in thinking on the cross. I heard somebody once say, you know, that seems normal to us because, you know, particularly in the Western world, Christianity's been this dominant religion for such a long time that crosses are almost, you know, well, they're so common within our society that they kind of, we almost don't even register them.
Well, they're stylistic now too,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Like you see like necklaces and different things that just become. I think the earring, they've got an earring with the cross. That's the newest, latest trend.
And I've got a book at home simply called The Cross, right? And it's just artwork from across Europe of crosses, right? And, you know, people have them as tattoos. You know, they're built into buildings. They're fashion items. You know, there's, you know, it's quite an interesting phenomenon at that level, and that can help us sometimes forget that this is a torture device, right? So, you know, so I've heard one pastor say, now I want to tweak this a little bit as we get into this, so we'll come back to this comment, but I've heard one pastor sort of say, you know, is it the same as us hanging like an AK-47, you know, around our neck on a necklace? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, or, you know, can you imagine somebody, you know, taking off their t-shirt, their shirt, and they've got a t-shirt on with a gallows, you know, execution, you know, with an electric chair or something like that on it. And I understand what people are saying when there's a sense of which, have we forgotten what the cross was? But of course, when you start to dig into the cross, you realize there's some nuance that actually the kind of AK-47 electric chair to cross comparison isn't quite the same. And I want to unpack that a little bit with us. But let's begin with that sense of the cross proves everything, but it's a torture device. So what do we make of that, right? So we want to almost have that thought just kind of churning around in our brain.
Sure.
So the other thing that's fascinating for us as Christians is the centrality of the cross to Christian theology, right? So Paul spends an inordinate amount of time talking about the fact that Jesus died and its implications and what that might mean. But what a lot of us somehow almost miss is how cross-focused the Gospels are. So there's a tendency to sometimes think, oh, well, it's just the last couple of chapters of the Gospels.
Right.
You get Jesus' death, right? And it's like the rest of it's about this, and you get this is just the kind of end of the story. And you ask people, you know, quite commonly, what are the Gospels? And people will go, well, you know, they're kind of like a biography of Jesus, right? One scholar says, actually, if you look at the Gospels, the phrase that they would use is that they're the passion narrative. So we might use this phrase. So the passion, the Greek word pascha, which means to suffer, has become this term of passion, is how it gets translated. So often when they talk about the passion narrative, they're talking about these last few hours of Jesus's life, and
right?
The sort of the passion of the Christ, you know, the name of the movie. It's all linked to this idea of the suffering. We kind of seem to think of passion in a slightly different way,
right?
But anyway, this one scholar pointed out that actually, if you look carefully, the Gospels, all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are essentially passion narratives with long introductions, right?
Right.
You know, John's Gospel, for example, the passion narrative starts around about chapter 13, right?
Right.
And you're only halfway through, and John's like, okay, now we're at the last few hours of Jesus' life,
right?
You know, and the last week of Jesus' life, and it's so if you think about how your Gospel divides up, Matthew and Luke, you get, you know, a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of days even of Jesus' birth,
Yeah.
big gap, and then you get 3 years of Jesus' life over a handful of chapters.
Yeah.
And then by the time you get to the Passion narrative, it's almost like working on a minute-by-minute breakdown of how the story goes. So what scholars are picking up on is the centrality of the cross is even stylistically presented to us in the Gospels, that so much space and time is given to them.
Right.
So we're basically adding some bricks to our wall that we're building here at the moment. What perhaps drives into some of this, Tyson, I think is key, is that we are looking on from the backside of 2,000 years of Christendom. So the cross is normal, right?
Yeah.
Crosses are everywhere. Churches are everywhere. Easter's here. I'm a pastor. You're a pastor. I meet friends. They're like, oh, it's probably a busy time of year for you because it's Easter, remembering Jesus' death. Like, it's just part of our culture.
Yeah.
What this does for us is robs us slightly of the uniqueness of the cross. Right, that in terms of religious content, the cross is absurd. Right, the cross doesn't make a lot of sense. It's the unique feature and perhaps the definitive feature of Christianity within history. That here we are, and it seems so normal to us, we forget the uniqueness of this. Talking about a religion, which we believe to be true, which at the center of the story is that the God dies, right?
Yeah.
Almost every other religious narrative works differently to this.
Right.
So, but we almost forget how weird that is. That's not how it's supposed to go.
Right.
Well, how do we even live with that? Well, because it's just become familiar to us in that sort of sense, right? So then I want to jump into a passage. Let's jump into a piece of Bible text for a moment here. That kind of just helps us connect with that. So this is St. Paul writing to the Corinthians. He's 18 verses into chapter 1 of his first letter to them.
Right.
And he says this: "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God." So there's an opening statement.
Yeah.
I always love the Greek in here because the Greek word that we translate foolishness here is the word moron.
Right.
Yeah. So I love the fact that not many of us realize that word's Greek. I don't know if that gives it more class now.
I think it does. I think if you use it in the proper context, it sounds like a classier word.
Yeah, it's true. So now that I've learned Greek, I refer to things as moronic more often.
There you go.
But the message of the cross is moronic, right? Paul says, and then he gives us two categories of people. People who are essentially perishing, he says, and people who are rescued. That's one way of reading this word, saved. So those who need rescued, those who are not rescued, perceive the cross differently, right? Which is quite interesting. And again, this speaks to this point. This is first century text. People are not the cross is not what you expect to happen to your hero, right? So here we have this. And Paul just outs and owns that. Right, if you hear this message is going to sound moronic to you.
Yeah.
Right? But then he quotes a piece from Isaiah. Paul says, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate." So my way of looking at this is Paul setting up an understanding of the cross, but he's getting in early, and he's saying, and I think about this in terms of worldview conversations, by the way, this isn't going to sound right. Right, this isn't going to. If you think you're really smart, you're going to hear this, and it's not going to compute properly for you. So then he continues. So where is the wise man? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has God not made moronic? This is my translation. Yeah. Has God not made moronic the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, that's Jesus, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. And then he says, Jews demand signs, but Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified. So Paul takes the two major people divisions that are in his world and says, actually, everybody misses this. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. So there's a little point we want to take hold of just for a second. What is it that's problematic for the crucified Jesus? Christ is a Jewish word. So it's not the idea that there's a Messiah that's a problem for the Jewish listener. It's the idea that there's a crucified Messiah that's the problem, right? But it's also foolishness to the Gentiles. Why do the Greek-speaking world think it's nuts that somebody would go around proclaiming, a crucified hero. So those are two thoughts we want to keep there. But to those who God has called, both Jews and Greeks, so bring them all together, Christ the power of God, the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. But then I think Paul does something different here, and this is going to help us, I think, a lot. Because even in this early stage in his letter, he's now leveraging his understanding of what the cross has done. But I want you to notice what's not there, right? Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose, right? So listen to this one. But God chose the moronic things of the world to shame the wise, right? So wisdom was the thing that we thought was wise. It now appears to be moronic. But the things the world thought was moronic, God's now using to say that the whole thing's getting turned upside down.
Right.
But notice that Paul's using the cross to influence something. He's not talking yet about forgiveness. He's not yet talking about salvation. He's actually talking about worldview, right?
Yeah.
And the cross is defining it, right?
Yeah.
So God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Notice this language of shaming. We're going to pick up on that as well. God chose the lowly things of this world, the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. So far, all we're hearing about the cross is that the cross changes how we perceive stuff. Right. Now, I've lived in church a lot of years. I heard a lot of sermons about the cross rescuing you from your sins, but you don't hear so many sermons that are doing exactly what Paul's doing.
I'm not sure if I've heard any sermons
doing that.
If I'm being honest, like, well, yours, David, but if I think about my own upbringing, that what you're saying is where a lot of the cross conversation starts. Is it starts with the forgiveness of sins, and not with what you're suggesting. Paul is actually saying this. Let's actually back the train up. We've got to. That's not where we start.
But isn't it fascinating? All we're doing is reading scripture. So it's not like we're taking an obscure verse and going, well, if you maybe think about this a little bit different, maybe we can see the cross changes how you see the world.
We're just backing up the train to go, well, let's just read what scripture and Paul is
and not
suggesting.
some obscure text, but literally chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, right? One of Paul's biggest letters.
Well, and he spends a lot of time in talking to the Corinthians about the message being veiled, and and how we're understanding those things. And
100%.
Again, it is a lot of worldview conversation that Paul has.
Absolutely. So this is where I think why he's saying it first, right? So if you're going to understand anything that I'm going to say, so this is a key point for us as Christians. Are we comfortable with the idea that once you've set the cross as your worldview, that's going to put you out of sync with how other worldviews perhaps work?
Right.
Holding competing worldviews rarely works well for you. So Paul's laying out his. So the cross nullifies the things that are. And then he says this, so that no one may boast. Now, we're going to talk about this again, but shame, he's talked a lot about things being shamed. The opposite of shame is boasting. And we know that. Like, we don't live in honor and shame culture in the Western context quite the same way as they do in other parts of the world and they did in the ancient world. But we all notice there's things which you kind of keep quiet and there's things that you boast around.
Yeah.
And the things that you boast around are very different. So Paul's now saying, actually, the things that we would often boast about, they're not the things you're going to want to boast about anymore.
Right.
Well, that makes sense because we boast about the things that other people are going to look at and go, wow, that is really cool.
Right.
So we would say, look at my new car, right? And we would say, and everybody go, wow, that's a really nice car.
Right.
If you said, look at my new car, it's awesome, and people turned and it was like a wreck of a bicycle, right? They would be like, well, that doesn't even make any sense to me.
Right.
But that's what upside down logic looks like. And
Right.
we've got form for this with Jesus. Jesus says, hey, if you want to be great, give all your money away. And we're like, well, that sounds like the opposite of great Jesus, right? So Paul's in a theme here of thinking like Jesus, which I think is important. But then no one may boast before Jesus because of this. He then says in verse 30 of chapter 1, it's because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us the wisdom from God. So we have wisdom. It's shown to be foolishness. So where are we going to go for wisdom now? There's one place Paul says we're going to find it in Jesus. And when Paul's talking about Jesus, he's always got the cross and resurrection in his mind. So it's worth thinking about. So our wisdom comes from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. So our trust, what we are putting all of our hope in, is essentially because that's what boasting does. It's also a level of which look at what I'm trusting in. So Paul then says this, he pushes it forward in chapter 2, so just continuing straight on. So it was with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I didn't come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. And then he says this, and this is one of my favorite verses of Paul, verse 8 of chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Right? So here Paul just makes this point, right?
Yeah.
That actually Jesus brings the whole house down on itself,
Yeah.
right? That the cross is going to subvert all of the world's wisdom. But so different is it from the way the world thinks that Paul says the irony is the rulers of this age with their false wisdom were the ones that crucified Jesus and in the end outed their whole system as bankrupt,
Right.
and outed the kind of moronicness of their way of thinking. So it's pretty harsh language. Paul, I don't think, wins a lot of awards for kind of unifying language sometimes.
Right.
Like he nails his colors pretty early on.
Yeah.
And he's basically going to say to us, if you're going to make sense of the cross, you're going to have to accept that the way you think is going to have to change.
Right.
Right? So holding that on there then, Tyson, I think there's a question that you almost want to ask at this stage with any discussion on the cross. In fact, I think I've got a quote in here about this. I find this is a fantastic book. If you're in for a long read, as you can see, it's a full. What are we in?
Well,
upwards towards 700 pages long.
Those that are just listening can't see your stack of books on the desk that I'm currently staring at. But
this is the Fleming Rutledge's book, The Crucifixion. The subtitle of the book is Understanding the Death of Jesus. It is a phenomenal read. It's not the sort of thing you're going to read in a couple of nights.
Yeah.
But Rutledge is a lifelong preacher, so her ability to communicate clearly is really high.
Right.
So there's a lot of big books on the cross that you can send to people, and nobody kind of really quite gets what they're going on. I don't think that's true of Rutledge's book,
Right.
so I would recommend it. But so I'm going to, from time to time throughout this, sort of jump into comments and things that we're going to find from this book. But Rutledge asks the question, and I think this is an important question for us to ask, and many people have asked this question before. And this is what I want us to wrestle with a little bit today. Let me think about it this way. We often come to the cross assuming that we know what the cross is going to do. Okay, so we work in what you would call in philosophical terms, we work from plight to solution. Right, I'm in a mess, and I need this solution to solve me. Right, and to solve things for me rather, and that's kind of how we work most of the time in life. What's the problem? How do I solve it?
Right.
If you look very closely at the New Testament, you actually realize that Jesus comes to a group of people who were not under the impression they had a problem, right? The people were, they had prophetic words that said they were God's people. They had promises that God was going to save them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think we need to ask, that everybody needs to ask about the cross, is this question essentially: what is the problem if the cross is the solution? Right. So Paul says, "I came with you to proclaim Christ crucified."
Yeah.
Right? But that's the first thing he presents. By the way, the cross is the solution. So you should logically then immediately ask yourself the question: but what's the problem then?
Right.
what kind? And then the other question is, how terrible must the problem be if the cross of Jesus is the solution to that problem?
Yeah.
Right? This causes us a variety of challenges and issues, I think, because the cross just doesn't fit the narrative of what we would often expect in that sort of sense. The cross is horrendous. The cross is horrific in that sort of level. And yet, Christian theology has been completely unified on the sense and notion that the cross is the answer. And I think where we've sold ourselves shallow on a whole host of Christian theology and regular everyday Christianity is because we've supplied the problem that the cross solves before really exploring the cross as the answer and figuring out what the problem was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if I'm hearing you correctly as you're saying this, this is where, and we might not be ready to get into this, but we might just be kind of a passing comment at this point in time and affirming or retweaking how you're saying things to make sure I'm understanding it. But this is where, when you're saying the narrative, the theories like penal substitutionary atonement, Christus Victor, like you can go through the list of them.
Yeah,
we've come to those conclusions, and those are the things, if I'm hearing you correctly, to say that's how we've explained why the cross is the solution. Is that am I hearing you correct on that?
Yes. So exactly that. So what tends to happen is that we decide what the problem is. So let's go with why. We'll jump into this at various points, but I'm a sinner, and I need eternal life.
Yes.
So therefore, if I've set that up as my problem, then I'm going to read the cross in a particular way to solve that particular problem. Does that make sense? And just for clarity's sake, that's not a bad thing to observe about yourself, that I am lost and I need help, right?
Right.
The problem is, if having found the cross as the answer to that problem, we now say, and that's what the cross is completely about.
Right.
Right? So, there's the old saying, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, you can use hammers for other things as well, and they might solve more problems for you. So you might insist, no, a hammer is just for banging nails into the wall. And then somebody goes, hey, but if you ever noticed, if you turn it around, you can also use it for pulling nails out of the wall, right? And also you can use it for bashing bits of wood, and you can use it for hitting screws if you need to, or but the problem is, if you get stuck in your paradigm and say, well, this is the problem I had and the cross has solved it, right? Then the cross is the answer to my problem, and that's all the cross needs to be about, right? Now, but think about this, right? And this is what we're talking about. So we never want to get too far away from 1 Corinthians 1. The cross makes everything else look foolish.
Yeah.
Okay, so think about, if you think your life is generally okay, but the only problem with your life is that you're not sure what happens when you die, right?
Yeah.
And now that might frame a lot of the Western issue, right?
It probably has framed a lot of thinking anyway.
So I know what I need my life to look like, but the problem is I don't know what happens when I die.
Right.
So I need that to be dealt with.
Yeah.
And then you encounter a preacher one day who says, Jesus died to save you from death so you can have eternal life. It's totally possible if you decide, well, that was my problem, and now the cross is my solution, and that's all the solution that I need. So I'm going to carry on living my life.
Yeah.
Knowing now that because I've believed in Jesus' cross,
yep,
I'm going to live forever when I die. Now, this is not me saying that it's not true, right? What I'm saying is that or it's not biblical in that sense.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that all the cross is about. Because the problem is, Paul's going to come along and say, well, the problem is, once you look at the world through the lens of the cross, this idea that you have that your life is basically okay, that might be problematic.
Right.
Because the cross is saying that foolishness is what the world's ways of thinking look like. You tracking with me?
Yeah, and I think, obviously we have more conversations than just the ones that are recorded that other people get to kind of listen in on. And you and I were talking the other day about this topic, even as we were kind of preparing to record something on this. And, you and I, you brought up the phrase in our conversation of how Paul likes to, suggest things to say, well, it's a little bit like this. And he uses that phrase a ton, which is what I'm hearing you start moving towards and how you're explaining this, is to say, actually, if you only look at it on one track, you're going to miss all these other teachings that Paul's going to continue to come back to say, well, it's also a little bit like this.
Yes.
And then fills in with a metaphor to help kind of further unpack how the cross and what it's doing within the world.
Absolutely. So this would be the first thing. If we're plowing into the question of the theology of the cross here at this point. So question number one then is, what is the problem if the cross is the solution? I think that's a devotional question to ask.
Yeah.
I think it's a theological question to ask. Like, what does the cross solve? And now, and all I'm going to say, this is not even close to all that I'm going to say.
I was going to say, I was going to be a long conversation is ending abruptly.
Well, what I'm going to say is this, is whatever answer you come up with. So, okay, I think the cross seems to solve this, right? Be careful of then closing the book.
Right.
Because it's not that Paul's going to say, no, the cross doesn't solve that. It's likely that he's going to say, yes, the cross does solve that. What else does it solve? Right? And is the cross even going to solve some problems that you don't know you even have? Right? Is it going to create some problems for you? Because once you get the solution, it's going to point out, actually, you've been carrying some problems you weren't aware of, and some stuff that you need to now do a bit of work on.
Well, and that comes back to the cross shaping the worldview piece, and 100%. Not just solution to your problem.
Yes. And so for me then, so what is the problem the cross is a solution of? Which leads us then to the question, well, what is the cross actually doing? Right? And there's a tendency within the Western model to focus quite heavily upon the cross is forgiveness for my guilt. Right? That's kind of, I think, and you can correct me if you think I'm misrepresenting there, but for a lot of people, I think what we hear in sermons, what we hear in evangelistic pieces, it's that you carry guilt for the things that you've done, and the cross is the solution for that, because now you have essentially in Christ got forgiveness for those things. I mean, do you think would that be the most dominant model, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I've ever, pinned it to guilt specifically.
Okay.
I definitely see that, and when you say that, it definitely resonates, and makes sense. I've just never really thought about it and had it connect with that word.
Well, let me throw it another way to you then. Have you heard the cross phrased like this? Jesus died so that you could be forgiven for all the wrong things you've done.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna say. The language that I've heard used a lot is around this idea of mistakes, which I don't even think is a helpful word, because mistakes, and when you want to look at a definition of sin, are all mistakes sin? Well, no. I can make I can try to build something and make a mistake in how I'm building it, and it's not a sin, right? So some of that language isn't necessarily helpful, but that's oftentimes in my own upbringing how it's been talked about, is it's this idea of the mistakes that you make.
Yes.
Which fits guilt.
And you're and that's kind of what I think you see a lot of people doing. So we even have songs. There's a song that we used to sing some years ago, about it being my sin that held Jesus on the cross. I can't now remember the title of the song, but and let's not go.
I can hear it in my head, and I almost started singing it. But
let's not go bashing songs in that sort of sense. But I think it's the line was something like, "It was my sin that held him there." Yeah. Right. Okay. So here's a problem biblically with that, is that if you read the Old Testament closely, there was a very effective mechanism for dealing with the wrong stuff that you do. Right, and this gets missed within a lot of kind of Christian interpretation. That up until Jesus, was anybody forgiven of their sin? Yes. Like who? Anybody that asked. Right. Yeah. So you read the Old Testament, you have this gracious God who has mechanisms in place for forgiveness, and then more than that, once a year in the Israelite festival tradition, you have this Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where the high priest comes out and offers this kind of whole process of sacrificing in order to forgive people of their sins. Yeah. So it's like, even if you've not asked for forgiveness, once a year, there's just a clean slate being wiped out, right? So, so oftentimes how we tell the story of the cross is quite ignorant towards the system that nowhere in the Old Testament is the system critiqued as faulty, right? Nowhere does the Old Testament say, well, but the problem with this is it doesn't actually work, right? You actually all still have sins on you. You're all still guilty, and therefore you're in big trouble. The Old Testament never says that. No. This system works, right? So the cross must be more than that. The cross must be, God is not going to send his son to basically marginally upgrade a system that wasn't faulty, right?
Yeah.
Now, the writer to the Hebrews actually picks up on this at this point and says, there is a problem here. And what the writer to the Hebrews does quite interestingly is kind of really dives into, throughout a lot of the book of letter to the Hebrews, this writer dives into this whole temple and atonement metaphor language in that sense.
Right.
And basically, there's this line, it's a beautiful line, where he says, we have this high priest who walks through the curtain and sits down at the right hand of God.
Yeah.
And it's a phenomenal line, because if you've seen or understood what happens in the high priestly kind of traditions, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest will ultimately go into the most holy place to pour out the blood sacrifice for everyone's forgiveness. But of course, what's fascinating is there's no seats in the most holy place, so there's nowhere to sit down. It's a standing ceremony. He performs the whole thing standing up. So I think when the writer of the Hebrews says, and we have this high priest who goes through that curtain into the most holy place and sits down, the reason that the writer of the Hebrews wants to point that out is that Jesus sits down because his work is finished.
Yeah.
And what you see in Hebrews is one of the critiques of the temple system isn't that the system isn't effective to forgive sin. It's that it's needed every year.
Yeah.
It's that we keep having to come back to this same problem, right? And we're going to keep cycling around it. So what happens, now let's come back to that in just a second, because we want to hang on this idea of what the writer of the Hebrews is doing, is he's basically then taking Jesus and what's happened on the cross, and then he's pointing out the Day of Atonement ceremony, which is a forgiveness ceremony, an atonement. It atones for everything wrong that's happened. And the writer of the Hebrews, he's basically saying, this comes back to the language you were using just there. He said, what you're looking at here, this Day of Atonement, well, that's a bit like what Jesus does on the cross for us, that somehow Jesus has almost acted like our high priest, and he's brought about forgiveness, right? And so what essentially he's doing is he's using the atonement ceremony as a metaphor for what Jesus has done on the cross.
Right.
And many people are quite happy just to live with that then. Oh, Jesus is the perfect sacrifice, therefore he's the one. But this is where I love this language that you mentioned just there. Actually, what the writer of the Hebrews is saying, no, it's a bit like that. Yeah. Because it's not exactly the same, right? Because the atonement, it happens every year, and the priest's standing up, and there was actually sacrifices of goats. And so Jesus isn't the same as that. But if you kind of understand what's going on there, you might understand a little bit more as to what's going on here, but there's more to it than that, right? And I think the problem for us within a lot of Western interpretation is we take that one metaphor and go, that's the only one we need. Yeah. That's now what the cross is doing. Yeah. But just as a jump-off point, so the Day of Atonement happens. There's a very brief history of the Day of Atonement. What happens is that the high priest takes 2 goats, right? And the 2 goats are chosen by lot, right? As to the role that they're going to play in the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement ceremony, right? Yeah. So the first goat, well, one of the goats is chosen to be killed, right? Yeah. And that goat gets sacrificed. Apologies to those who are squeamish on this sort of stuff. That goat gets sacrificed, and its blood is poured out in the most holy place. So that's kind of gross. But so that's right. The second goat gets classified as the scapegoat, right? Yep. The Hebrew or the Aramaic is the Azazel, that literally translates as the taken away one, right? And then what happens is part of the ceremony, they then take this goat and they kind of lead it out into the desert and let it go free, right? And it becomes a symbol. And there is some later tradition where they show this goat having kind of red cord tied around its head as a symbol of what it's carrying. And it's like the taken away one is taken away, as are our sins. Yeah. Right? Now, as tradition develops, there becomes all sorts of nervousness about how far away you need to take the goat, because you know you don't want to wake up the next morning and see that goat eating your flowers.
Exactly. Just outside where you're sleeping.
The goat that carries the sins of all the nation is in my backyard. Back. So two things started to develop actually in earlier Israelite times. They would pay a non-Israelite to take the goat away. So it'd be basically like, you have this goat and you take it wherever you want, because no Israelite wants to take that goat. So you give it to somebody who doesn't believe in this system, and listen, once you're out of town, whatever you do with it, that's yours. Just don't make it come back. And it seems by the time of the Jerusalem temple, they used to take the goat and throw it off a cliff, right? Which is even more gross in some sense, but to make sure it never comes back. So you have the goat that's sacrificed, right? And you have the scapegoat, the taken away goat. Now, what's interesting is that Hebrews picks up on Jesus as a metaphor of the goat that's sacrificed, right? So he has this eternal blood and, that covers it over. But then in John's gospel, during the trial scene of Jesus, Pilate brings Jesus out in front of the crowd, right? And he says to the crowd, so here's Jesus, and the crowd are a bit riotous at this point, to put it mildly. And Pilate says to the crowd, what do you want to do with him, right? And when you pop quiz people on this question and say, well, what did the crowd respond? Almost everybody says, they responded, crucify him, right? What's interesting, in John's gospel, the first time that Pilate asks the crowd, what do you want to do with him? They don't say, crucify him. They say, take him away. Right. It's the Greek word airo, which means take away or lift up. So some translations say lift him up. But it's interesting that John, I think, is playing on the fact that actually you've got the crowd saying, take him away. And John now is pulling out another metaphor of Jesus as the scapegoat. Right, so he's the one upon whom all the sin is visually poured and is taken away from the people, right? So which one's right? Okay, is Jesus the first goat or the second goat? Well, let's push that a little further, because now also in John's gospel, he sets up the scene that Jesus essentially functions as the Passover lamb. Right? Now, the Passover lamb is a meal that the Israelites eat. It's got nothing to do with the Day of Atonement. It's to celebrate the Exodus when they were freed from slavery. And John says, Jesus was like this, right? And in fact, there's one moment in John's gospel where he has Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He takes both metaphors and goes, well, let's put them together.
And most people would read that and go, well, it's one metaphor. They wouldn't actually consider them to be two being mashed together.
100%, right? So is Jesus the first goat that's sacrificed and its blood's poured out? Is he the second goat who's taken away into the desert? Or is he the lamb? We're now building a farm here. Is he the lamb that rescues the Israelites from slavery? The answer, yes. Right? He's all of these. And this is us just dealing with a couple of things here, but notice there's been a subtle shift, right? The first metaphor of the first goat is about pouring out his blood to rescue us from sin, or to forgive our sins. The second one is about him being a scapegoat that takes away our punishment. The third metaphor is about deliverance. Right, so it's not about forgiveness of sin, right? The slavery in Egypt wasn't about sinfulness; it was the fact that some oppressive powers had entrapped them, right? So just subtly in John's telling of the story, right, there's just a new ideas come in. That if you're going to insist that the cross is about forgiveness of sin, the Passover metaphor about release from slavery isn't going to make a lot of sense for you, because you're going to go, I'm going to read about the Passover, and you're going to see there's no mention of sin in this. This is not about a rescue from sin. This is about a rescue from an oppressive power, from some. It's a deliverance, really. In that sort of sense. And so what happens often is that a whole host of our ways that we talk about the atonement generally struggle to cope with both of those aspects. And I would argue that in the New Testament, both of those aspects are always present. That the cross is forgiving at one level, and it's also deliverance at another level. So my way of understanding it is, and this goes back to what I was saying, Jürgen Moltmann said earlier on about the idea that the cross kind of resists a clear interpretation somewhere. You've got models of the atonement which are explaining forgiveness, and models of the atonement that are explaining rescue. So I like to think of it as like a bicycle wheel, I think, is the metaphor that let's add a metaphor to explain metaphors, Tyson, because that's not going to be confusing at all. So if you imagine that central hub of your bicycle, right?
Yeah.
So there is a cross, and we know that it's accomplished something.
Yeah.
Now, what's fascinating, while you're holding that image in your head at the center of that wheel, what's fascinating is all of the New Testament writers, in unison, never actually tell us exactly how the cross works. Right. In fact, Paul's language is there's a mystery to it.
Yeah.
Right? What they do instead is they give us metaphors that try and get us close to what it means. So this comes into this bit like, right?
Yeah.
It's a bit like the Day of Atonement. Well, what is it like in the Day of Atonement? Well, it's a bit like the goat that gets sacrificed. But it's also a bit like the goat that's the scapegoat. It's also a bit like the Passover story, when we were all released into Egypt. Now, if you imagine each of those things, the goat that's sacrificed, the goat that's the scapegoat, the Passover story, if you imagine them as spokes, right?
Yeah.
And once you get enough spokes around the wheel, you've got something you can build on, right? You actually can put your outer ring in the wheel and you can actually ride this bicycle, perhaps. In Galatians chapter 3, when Paul's talking about what Jesus does, he uses the phrase ex agora in the Greek. The agora was the marketplace, and ex literally means out of. So when Paul decides to try and explain to this Gentile crowd, just a throwaway comment about what Jesus did, which, by the way, they're a Gentile crowd, so they're not Jewish. So so atonement metaphor doesn't make any sense. It's like me sitting here using soccer metaphors to explain to you, a hockey fan, right? And then you give me hockey metaphors, and I'm like, nope, still losing it here.
Yeah.
So Paul turns up in Galatia and starts talking about Day of Atonement. People are like, nope, so never seen that, can't figure that one out. Paul goes, don't worry, Passover. And they're like, yep, no, don't got that one either. So then Paul, this is I'm filling in the blanks here. I think you can almost see Paul go, oh, what do you know, right? And then he goes, oh, you've been to the agora, right? And the agora is where you go to buy and sell slaves, right? So you go down to the marketplace, you buy onions, you buy potatoes, you buy a slave, right? I mean, it's a barbaric world that Paul,
yeah.
I was going to say it's a barbaric world that Paul lives in. It was a form of the barbaric world that we all live in, right?
Yeah.
So Paul goes down, Paul's in the marketplace, he's seeing the trading of slaves as property. And so I go down, I see your slave, I give you the money, I take your slave, their slave becomes mine. Paul, filling in the blanks, Paul says, imagine if you were at the market one day and somebody comes down and they want to ex agora a slave, which is to take them out of the marketplace. So they come to you, they say, that slave is, I would like them. That you say, well, it's this much money to buy them. So what happens then is I give you the money, but instead of taking that slave home as my slave, I give them their freedom, right? And I actually take them out of the marketplace system, right? Paul says to these Galatians, could you imagine that, right? And again, that's not in the text, but it's going to... So, and all of a sudden everybody goes, oh, we've seen that image before. Right, okay, so Paul goes, okay, so what Jesus does is kind of like that, right? So now we have another spoke appears that it's kind of like, what if a slave was set free, in a buy-off sort of system? And what you see is consistently, all through the New Testament, these new metaphors are being applied to try and help us understand two core things. That on one angle, there's atonement happening in the cross, right? Something's being put right, something's being fixed, and then another angle, we're being delivered from something, right? Am I tracking so far?
Yes, I'm following.
So what happens then? And then, of course, there's also basic logics where Jesus offers metaphors as well, right? So, here's what's funny is, you mentioned that thing, penal substitution. So that's a theory where Jesus is substituted in our place to take upon himself the judgment that was due for us, right?
Yes.
So that's one way of reading, what's going on the cross, right? And you'll find, and people have some big fights, by the way. There's some big fights out there in the world about, amongst Christians who some say it's all about penal substitution.
Oh, yeah.
And some say, no, I don't like that.
Yeah.
And depending on how you push penal substitution, if you have it exclusively as your only model and push it to its furthest degree, it gets really awkward after a while, because essentially you start ending up with, why is Jesus paying a punishment for a crime that's committed against God, rather the Father? Why would the Father, given that he's the one owed, not just cancel the debt, right? And you start, but this is the problem with metaphors, right?
Yes.
If you push them too far,
They always
they
fall
invariably
apart.
start failing. The early church had this. So let's put another spoke in. The early church pick up on this language of ransom, right? That actually it seems like one way of talking about Jesus' death is it pays a ransom for sin. And the early church fathers said, this is a great explanation that Jesus basically bailed us all out of a hostage situation. And everybody goes, that works. And that the church hung on that for quite a few hundred years, that this is what the cross does. And then somebody pipes up and sort of says, well, wait a minute, like, who was the ransom paid to?
Right.
And everybody then pauses, and I'm being facetious here with this, but everybody then pauses and go, well, maybe it was paid to the devil. And then somebody says, well, since when was God beholden to the devil? That doesn't work as a system. So then somebody goes, well, it must be paid to himself. And then you realize, well, that doesn't make any sense that God would take Jesus' life to pay off a debt that was owed to him. Like, at which point you would go, no, I'm going to lose in this. Let me just let it all go. So that's where penal substitution started to come in, where it was about a kind of switch of judgment at some point. The judgment had to be meted out somehow. But then Jesus himself, like, so people argue, well, I'm about penal substitution, I'm about this, I'm about that. You never hear people saying, well, my atonement model is the seed model, right? But yet Jesus, he says, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it can't produce more, right? Well, that was Jesus' explanation for what the cross was going to be about, right? So here's another spoke for our
It's
wheel.
going to be a little bit like...
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit like. One of my favorites is that... Is the salsa definition of the cross, right? That
I don't think I've heard this.
No, it's true. Now I love Mexican food, right? So salsa is a kind of common feature of my life. The difference between a really good salsa and a really bad salsa is essentially this: a really good salsa is made up entirely of ingredients that used to be alive. And a really bad salsa is made up of chemicals, right?
Sure.
So, and if you speak to your average nutritionist, they'll tell you, eat food that used to be alive, right? Don't eat food that never was alive, right? So, eat an apple, not a Twinkie, right? You know what I mean? And,
something made in a factory.
Yeah, exactly.
With a bunch of chemicals.
Yes, it's probably
the best
not
choice.
good. Now, this is quite fascinating, right? Because when you say to somebody, the cross, well, that just sounds random, that Jesus died to bring us all life. That doesn't make any sense at all. But Jesus actually explains it to us. Unless a grain of seed falls to the ground and dies, it cannot bring forth more life. It's just the way the world works. The reason that you're alive and that I'm alive is because we constantly fill our bodies with things which are dead, which used to be alive. And the result of putting those dead things in our bodies is that we gain life.
Right.
So there is a way to look at the cross that goes, well, this is just how the world works, right? That death brings life, right? And all that Jesus is doing is taking that up into a cosmic sort of level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So now you add another. So if you keep working through it and kind of just pointing out that, there's another definition of the cross is just being given, does that make sense? It's like, again, let's go back to John's gospel. John jumps back into a story in early Israel where these poisonous snakes were biting everyone and everyone was dying. And the Lord gives Moses this miraculous cure where he ties a snake to a post and stands up, and if people look at the post, they're saved. John picks that up and says, just as Moses lifted up a snake in the desert, Jesus is lifted up on the cross, and everybody that looks to him is saved, right? So there's another spoke for your wheel, right? What you end up with is the New Testament is giving you a whole host of metaphors to try and help you understand, I think, two core points. That the cross is an atonement for sin, and it's also about deliverance, right? But do you want to say anything about that, actually? Because I can just keep going.
No, I'm just happy for you to keep going on that. You're moving,
But let's just hold that for a second then. So deliverance from what, and atonement or forgiveness from what? These are key questions for us. And where I'm going to sort of probably put down a line that I want to talk about quite strongly, I suppose, is that, let's come back to the song. Poor worship leaders worship songwriters getting a hard time from me. It was my sins that held him there. I want to argue that that's actually not true, right? For a couple of reasons. Number one, sins, the things that you do which are wrong, okay, had a solution in the Old Testament. I've already said that. They had a solution in the Old Testament that worked, okay? The Old Testament doesn't critique its lack of work. It critiques the sort of the bigger problem, right? The other problem is this. You may have noticed, post the cross, we still have problems with them, right? That we still do wrong things, right?
Yeah.
We still get caught up in naughtiness, right? Let's use that, for our language. We make mistakes, which again, I'm with you. Just please don't ever explain sin to your children as mistakes, right? Because it just doesn't help them, right?
No.
Like talk about growing children up with a guilt complex that
Seriously.
Jesus died on the cross because you make mistakes, right?
Yeah, when you tripped on the sidewalk.
Yeah. And now the other problem is this. Once we take that idea that the cross is to help with all of the wrong things that I do, we get caught up in a couple of problems. Number one, we get caught up with the guilty complex in that sort of sense. We also get caught up in what Dallas Willard, brilliant Christian writer Dallas Willard, he has this phenomenal line that he hides in a footnote of his book, The Divine Conspiracy, where he talks about how if we absolutely focus that the cross of Jesus rescues us all from the wrong things that we do, we end up with what Willard calls vampire Christianity, right? Where we are interested in Jesus for his blood and nothing else. Right?
I've never heard that. And I've also never read a footnote of a book for further explanation on anything. So I would have completely missed Willard's.
I'm convinced he hid it in a footnote thinking this is a great line and I'm going to see who finds it, right?
It wouldn't have been me.
But think what a descriptive term, Yeah. I'm just interested in Jesus for his blood because that helps me with the wrong things that I have done, right? Here's the problem, though, like I say, that's not what the Bible does with all of this. So to understand this, I often try and kind of divide it up into it's kind of easy to do in English, actually, because the way we talk about it. But I like to think about two categories, right? The first category, if I was taking notes, would be sin. And I'd write that with a capital S-I-N, right, in the singular. So capital S, singular. And then in the second category, I talk about sins, lowercase s, in the plural, right? And sins, lowercase s, in the plural, is the stuff that I do, which is wrong, right? And then sin, the capital S in the singular, this is the problem, right? So let me just, for the first time, venture forward. Here's what I think the problem is. It's sin with a capital S, right? But you want to keep these two things slightly separate from each other, right? We have a tendency within the Western context to focus exclusively on the sins thing, when actually we really need to think a little bit more about this sin thing. And in Paul, you would see this sin, capital S, is an anti-God power that has invaded God's good creation, right? And that's what's actually wrong with the world. So let me quote Fleming Rutledge for a second there. She would say sin isn't wrongdoing or naughtiness, right? That's sins, right? Sin, let me use, it's funny, Fleming Rutledge uses this descriptor of sin, which is really timely at the moment. She's like, sin is an infectious disease, right? And it's the problem it's the cosmic problem at the root of the world, right? That there's something broken in the world that is destroying God's good creation. The wrong stuff that you and I do, that's just the side effects of the actual problem.
Right.
So metaphorically, I've described it like this in the past, and I always apologies if this is insensitive, but if you go to your doctor and you say to your doctor, I keep getting really bad headaches, and your doctor takes some brain scans and then says, it turns out you have a tumor in your brain, but here's some Tylenol, right? And so you go home and you take the Tylenol and it helps with the headaches a little bit, but then the headaches keep coming back. So then you go back to your doctor and go, man, the headaches are back. So he goes, well, here's some more Tylenol, right? Eventually you're going to go and get a new doctor, right? Because you're going to go, you told me there was a big problem, but you're only treating the symptoms.
Yeah.
Right? So if there's a big problem in the world theologically, it's sin, capital S. And how do we know there's a problem is actually because of sins, lowercase s. You tracking with me?
Yeah, I'm tracking.
So what we tend to do within modern Christian theology is focus on sins, right? The problem is they're just symptoms, right? So the wrongdoings are just symptoms. They're the stuff that when I'm a jerk to you, that's just the symptoms of a bigger problem. And if I keep dealing with my jerkiness, it's not necessarily dealing with what's actually causing this, right? So why that's important to note is if you read Paul closely, Jesus doesn't die on the cross for your symptoms. He dies on the cross to conquer sin, right? And that's the deliverance piece. The net result of him conquering sin is he's able to bring atonement for all of the mess that you're making of your life. But you can't, you should, the headache's a problem, right? For the patient that we're talking about, the headache's a problem. But eventually somebody's going to step in and go, when are we going to deal with the issue?
Right.
Because once we deal with the issue, eventually the symptoms will disappear. Is that making sense?
Yep.
So we kind of track that sort of thing through. Now, this is why the cross also, on a very practical nature, Tyson, the cross really kind of kicks in against human optimism, really, at some sort of level, because the best we can probably manage to figure out, and in some level, I'd say every religion in history has gotten itself caught up with the problem of trying to deal with the symptoms, right? It's like, if you can do this, you'll be okay. If you can do that, you'll be okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas what Jesus is doing on the cross is saying, no, there's a bigger problem that nobody's dealing with, and this is what we're here to deal with. We're here to deliver you from the power of sin, right? The sins will eventually be dealt with, right? But let's deal with the actual problem, which is why Christians today have issues of sins, but the impact of sin has been removed from them. So you've kind of got leftover hangover features at some sort of level that you're still suffering from some symptoms because the world around us is still suffering with that. But what Paul constantly does is, but the actual problem, you've been delivered from that.
Right. And you're adding, in what you're explaining too, is you're adding another spoke into this wheel that we're talking about.
Yes.
And, some of what you're touching on is another atonement theory of, Christus Victor and power over, the evil and sin within the world compared to what you're saying of sins being our wrong doings and breaking, So it definitely resonates around, and I like how you explain that. The difference between sin, capital S, and sins, lowercase, and separating them into two categories. Because I would agree with you. I think that a lot of the conversation, when you hear about it in church, and I'm sure I have been guilty of it, at points in my own leadership journey, is the focus on the symptoms, to talking about sins, plural, and Jesus died for your sins, plural. And we still, even though the cross has happened, we still can miss this distinction that is really happening. And that's why, again, I really like that analogy of the wheel and needing to have these multiple spokes to say, if we're going to make any sense of it, and I still think at the end of the day, we're going to say, there is my complete wheel. I've got a lot of spokes. I can ride it. There's still a lot of mystery.
100%. And this is why. So what the danger is, right? And this let's channel a little bit more Dallas Willard for a second. His brilliant Vampire Christianity.
Yes.
He said that once we've decided that Jesus died for our sins, and his blood was to deal with that. He said, if that's what the cross is about, he said, we end up with what he calls the gospel of sin management. Right? So let's be critical of people in our profession for a while. If you listen to a lot of sermons, they are obsessed with just trying to keep people on the straight and narrow.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
And it's like, and becomes, and Willard says, it just becomes about sin management. If everybody doesn't sin, then we're okay. That was a good week, right? And then you go reading the New Testament, but it just doesn't seem tracking. It doesn't seem caring about that even. You don't get a lot of sin management in the New Testament. What you get is where Jesus is trying to deal with the problem, right? He wants to rescue you from the power of sin and evil, right? So it'd be like if imagine you're going into surgery now because let's stick with the brain tumor metaphor, and the doctor says to you, "Hey, don't worry, those headaches will be gone soon," right? Well, in truth, a long time, ago, probably around about the time the doctor first said tumor, the headaches became the least of your worries, right? You know what I mean? Like you go to the doctor with the headaches, you're then told about the tumor, I'm not worried about the headaches now, I'm worried about the tumor, So the problem is what we've done to push that metaphor into our world is we're still banging on about the headaches, right? Trying to tell people how to stop their headaches, keep taking that Tylenol, when actually Jesus has liberated us at a far greater level. Now, I'm a Pauline scholar, so Paul kind of jumps in at this point and says, well, should we just do whatever we want then?
Yeah.
Like, no.
Because I was going to say, as you keep going this metaphor, you're going to scare a lot of people with some traditional backgrounds that have heard,
Actually, Paul, of course, so somebody says, so Paul says, so what? So should we just go on sinning then so we can encounter more grace? Paul's like, no, by no means should we do that. The point is, we don't manage our sins, right? Because that's just effort, it's tiring, it becomes works, it becomes legalism. Rather more, we live in the rescue that we've had, through Christ, and we allow that to shape who we are, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, but let me just name something just really important then, as people are listening through to this, and great work if you're still listening with us at this stage. I don't know if this is day 3 or 4, or your fifth trip to the store that you're still hanging on with this podcast. I want to name something that we're saying here that needs to be named, right? And like it's been implied for the whole, sort of first hour of our conversation here, that the cross is actually doing something, right? Now that sounds like a really lame thing to say. But I want to say that the cross, what we're saying theologically in the New Testament is unequivocally clear on this. The cross is actually doing something. In contrast with the very common notion that I'm seeing growing more and more in the Western theology, that the cross is showing us something, right? So have you ever heard anybody say the cross shows us that God loves us, right?
Yeah, or versions of, of that, yeah.
That's not what the cross is about, right? We already knew that. Right, so for me, if the Father is going to send His Son to die on the cross, right, you've got to tell me something new. It's like, and so the Old Testament from start to finish is God loves you, right? and is you go read Hosea, like that's the message there. Even though you're a jerk, God still loves you, right?
Yeah.
So we don't need God to sacrifice Himself, right? We don't need Jesus, God the Son, to die on a cross to tell us something we already knew, right? But what you're seeing, and this comes with a particular take on Christianity and a particular take on Jesus, which is to say that actually Jesus is just a pretty regular guy who's basically showing for us a different way of life, right? So the cross becomes, this is how you resist evil, this is how you stand up against oppression, that you give yourself, and the cross becomes essentially exemplary of the way of us being, right? That's not what Paul does, right? So Paul doesn't say that the cross is exemplary simply of how we should live. What Paul does is he says the cross did something, it accomplished something, it destroyed the powers of sin and evil. The net result of that is we are now empowered to live the example that Jesus lived out in His own life. Does that make sense? So yes, the cross is exemplary, having first done something. And the difference is that forgiveness brings the Holy Spirit, like Paul's very clear on that in Galatians, that the Spirit has done something in your life and therefore is forming you and shaping you into a Christ-like nature.
Yeah, and he gets into Galatians 2, which you and I both really love that for various different reasons. But that idea of us being crucified, right? And I that's where I really see Paul saying that, like, something has been done, on the cross and in you, that is now changes things and changes how we look at things and how we view things and how we behave within the world around us.
Absolutely. So for me, like, try and escape the notion as best as you can that the cross is simply exemplary, right?
Yeah.
If Fred died on the cross, the world is not saved, right? A lot of people died on Roman crosses. Like, they were good at it, right?
Yeah, they knew what they were doing.
But there's only one person that we're talking about that has somehow cosmically changed the world according to their death on the cross, which makes the point that the cross isn't exemplary. The cross is doing something, the net result of which changes everything, right?
Yeah, because if it's an example, if you want to, look at some of the, the cross and who gets crucified and, and some of that stuff, really the cross was the Romans' way of saying, you want to try and start something?
Yes.
you won't. You're a rebel with a cause that will find yourself nailed, to a cross and put on the main roadway for everyone to walk past you and mock you and for them to make an example of you. So speaking of examples, that was the Roman way of doing it, was to make
100%,
examples.
100%. So and this goes back to what we started hinting at right at the start, and it's an important question, like, who gets crucified?
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's important to clarify a couple of things in there. That realistically, with the exception of some illegalities that happened in the Roman world, there's two categories of people that get crucified. So there are runaway slaves, right, and basically rebels against the Roman system, right? So insurgents, insurrectionists, these sort of people. Now, in the Roman mind, those two things are actually key, right? So the statistics, Tyson, that I should have looked up before we started recording, and so now they've escaped me, but a huge percentage of the Roman Empire was in some form of slavery, right? And so slaves, like there was in some cities, slaves outnumbered people 2 to 1.
Right.
Okay. So, you might know the story of Spartacus, right? Who led this slave uprising against Rome. This is Rome's great fear. You see it in you see it in a lot of Roman documentation from the time period of Jesus, that there's this great fear of, what if the slaves organize themselves, right? Because imagine it, you're an oppressed people, but you outnumber everybody 2 to 1, like that can go nasty for the people who are the oppressors really fast.
Yep.
So what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to basically de-incentivize, is the word. You can cut that from the podcast later. De-incentivize how do we de-incentivize the slave from uprising? Well, what we do is, the moment a slave breaks the rules, we inflict upon them the most hideous torture that they can imagine, which will basically, ruin anyone's kind of enthusiasm for breaking the rules against Rome. Conversely, when you're an empire that's spread all the way across the Mediterranean, the last thing you want is one city deciding, we're just going to uprise and take our city back, right? So the other group of people that you want to de-incentivize fighting very highly is rebels, right? So what the Romans do then is they come up with the cross, right? As essentially, exactly as you say, as a method of discouraging anybody from fighting against Rome. So this goes back. I made the point earlier on that maybe the executioner's chair and the cross are not quite the same thing, right? Now, the death penalty clearly has an intention within our society within societies that still have the death penalty. The idea is to try and put you off doing particular crimes, although pretty much most of the evidence suggests that it doesn't, right? But that's another ethical conversation for a different day, right? Yeah. And so we'll just bypass that for a second. Here's what I would want to say really importantly. The cross is not an execution device, right? And that's the thing that I think a lot of people get muddled up with. The cross is the way that the Romans killed their enemies. It's not, right? Because, number one, it was literally two classes of people that were killed on crosses, right? Runaway slaves, and perhaps disobedient slaves, you want to push it, and rebels. Now, interestingly, of course, brief aside, before we do that, most of us hear quite regularly about Jesus dying between two thieves, right? And so we go, wait a minute, you've just said it's runaway slaves or rebels, but Jesus died between two thieves, so obviously it was thieves as well. Now, here's a little problem for you at this point. The Greek word is Jesus died between two leistes, right? That's the Greek word that's used. Leistes translates as, wait for it, rebels, right? Insurrectionists.
Yeah.
So why do we translate it as thieves? Well, here's the ironic problem. When the King James Bible was being translated, King James had just a little too much involvement. Let's just say that, right? So, I'm gonna.
You're offending every
King James only person.
Fan,
yeah. Okay, so two things, just two places that King James had a little bit too much involvement, right? Jesus had a brother. Okay, pop quiz. Do you remember what his name is?
James.
Yes. No.
What?
Yeah. Jesus had a brother. His name was Jacob, right? And if you pick up a Greek translation, a Greek sort of a text of the Bible, you'll notice that Jesus had a disciple called Jacob, and there's even a book of the Bible called Jacob, right? It's right there. It's right there at the back. But when the Bible was being translated in the 1600s under King James,
I think I see where this is going.
King James said, wouldn't it be really nice if one of the disciples had my name, right? And wouldn't it be really nice if one of the books of the Bible had my name as well? And then Jacob, James, it's kind of close enough.
Well, starting
and
letters.
Therefore, bizarrely, in the English tradition, all of a sudden this book James appears. So you just, pick up the phone and call one of your German friends and say, hey, by the way, the book of James. And they'll go, the book of what? Because they'll go, we have a book of Jacob, but we don't. So in English tradition, we have this book of James. This has got nothing to do with my sermon, right? Or this talk that we're doing just now. But let's just put that over to one side. James got involved in stuff. Another thing that James got involved in, King James got involved in, he's Scottish, so we can just refer to him as James. We don't need to say King James.
Okay. Perfect. You're on a first name basis.
Yeah, it's true. The other thing that King James did was, and whether it was exactly him or his advisors, there was a little bit of discomfort that, bear in mind, he's the king, so he represents the power of the day. If we have Jesus being crucified between two rebels, it directs people towards the realization that Jesus is a rebel. He's not a slave, so clearly he's been executed as a rebel, which is so clear from the story. If you look at it, this man claimed he was the king of the Jews. It's a rebel execution that's going on in this sort of context. So they changed the language in the King James from Lestes being insurrectionist to Lestes being thief, right? So therefore dropping Jesus down into the category of common criminal rather than opponent of the state. And that then has now kind of settled into our society in that sense, that you hear it in songs, kids' Bibles, mainstream church. It's all there. Jesus, dying between two robbers, right? But the Romans didn't crucify robbers, right? That was because it was so barbaric. You have to do something it was a political execution, whether it was political to keep slaves in order or political to actually, disincentivize. I keep using that wrong word, but de-incentivize, your rebels. Now, I've used another wrong word in there. I said it was an execution. So let's go back to what I was saying just now. It's not an execution, the cross isn't. The cross is a torture device. The barbaric nature of it as a torture device is that it is so bad that nobody survives it, right? But the cross, an actual definition of the cross, which I think would be better, is the cross is a mechanism. So just kind of trigger warning, this is all kind of gets a little gross for a while, but the cross is a mechanism which is designed to inflict as much pain as it can on a person without killing them. Right? So essentially what happens is you flog and beat a person up to the point that they are not in good health by the time you get them to a cross, right? You then essentially nail them to these beams through their wrists and their ankles, and hang them then upright outside of the city, generally in the Mediterranean sun, right? So this is a shocking situation. Simply leaving somebody outside for several days in the Mediterranean sun, the sunburn is going to be so catastrophically bad. That alone is a problem for them. Right? But now you generate a problem where essentially, and this is where you start to see the barbaricness of crucifixion. And interestingly, of course, crucifixion was so barbaric that it's not until the 3rd or 4th century that you start to see Christians using the cross as a symbol. Prior to that, the Christians didn't use that. They used the symbol of the fish, right? And it's generally thought that the Christians only started using the cross as a symbol after the Romans stopped crucifying someone. If you'd seen a crucifixion, you don't want to be reminded of that. Yeah. So what you do then is you put your person that's crucified up on this cross, and now you essentially, in the kind of genius of their barbarism, you make the human fight between two competing tendencies: the human desire to be alive and the human desire to avoid pain. And so what happens is when you're hanging on a cross, essentially you can't breathe. Right? Because of the way that you're hanging, your lungs can't work properly because your arms are stretched in the wrong fashion. You're very weak. You physically can't take full breaths. So the only way that you can take a full breath is to actually lift yourself up so that you can kind of move the position of your arms so that you can then take a full breath. The problem is your ankles are nailed to this wood. So lifting yourself up to breathe is insanely painful. Right? So you essentially put the person into a quandary wherein their own unconscious self will fight to breathe with all of its gut and constantly be caught in a minute-by-minute play between pushing up on all of this agonizing pain and filling your lungs or suffocating. And generally speaking, when humans start to suffocate, the automatic systems take over and you then start pushing up.
Yeah.
Eventually what happens is you dehydrate, run out of food. Well, you run out of food, dehydrate, and then essentially just expire. The problem is most people that are being crucified have people connected to them. So those people start hanging around near the cross, and you see this in Jesus' life. They start then trying to feed them. So they would put what do you call it? Food. What do you call it? It's a really impressive word.
There you go.
They would put food onto a stick and hold it up for the person to eat. Right. They would put sponges on sticks soaked with kind of some sort of wine or some sort of wine vinegar for them to get the idea being that both the alcohol would kind of dull their senses a little bit and they'd have some fluid. Brief aside, because we've got to do this sort of stuff. Somebody puts a sponge of wine vinegar on a stick and passes it up to Jesus in John's gospel. You remember the scene?
Yeah.
And but John does something really fascinating at this point. This is, again, we're off topic for a second.
Sure.
But you're gonna love it. John says they put the sponge on a hyssop branch, right? If you're a Jewish reader reading this, like ding, 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 all the lights start flashing on your dashboard. Number one, this is a really strange comment from John, because if you were going to try and poke a branch up to somebody to have a drink on a sponge, you wouldn't use hyssop, right? Because hyssop is like a reed-like plant that's very flexible, right? So you kind of imagine this scene of this, this kind of bendy sponge, right? But it's really strange. It's almost impossible. You'd have to find a really peculiar piece of hyssop to be able to do that, right? Which is not impossible. It's not impossible, but it would be strange, right? But why does John tell you it's hyssop, right? Well, let's go back to our metaphors just for a second. If you go back to Exodus, and God is instructing the Israelites about how they're going to leave Egypt when he comes to rescue them, he tells them to paint blood on the doorposts of their houses so that the angel of death will know that it's the people of God inside. This strange little story that's there. Can you remember what type of reed God tells the Israelites to paint the blood with?
I'm going to go out on a limb. And it's the hyssop branch.
It's hyssop, yeah. So it's a beautiful little scene that John just by the way, in case you forgot what's going on here, this is you remember. Let's throw a new atonement metaphor.
Yeah,
it's when the Israelites painted blood over the doorpost and death passed them by. Right, what is going on the cross? It's like death passing you by. Right, so you just another spoke goes in. Right,
yeah.
So what you would do though is you would give fluids then to the person that's being crucified. Okay, this is really cruel, right? If you really love the person that's being crucified, you don't feed them anything, right? Because the quicker they run out of food, the quicker they dehydrate, the quicker they die. They're going to die, right? There's a Roman soldier stood in the background. If you try and take him down, he's going to kill you instead, right? So they are going to eventually expire up here. So if you're really kind, what you do is you try and get a head start on the Roman soldier and you break your friend's legs, right? Because once you've smashed their legs, they physically cannot push themselves up and they'll suffocate within a matter of minutes, right? So the Roman soldier is positioned to stop you taking them down and speeding the process up, right? There's some stories out there of people trying other more creative methods to try and kill their friends that were hanging on the cross, because it's actually the kind thing to do, right? Because it's such a barbaric thing. So this person essentially and it can take days to crucify somebody,
right?
Because they will just keep fighting and keep just getting a little bit more energy and keep going on. Fascinating if you think about the Jesus story in the Gospels, because Sabbath is coming the next day, the Roman soldier comes out and breaks their legs, in order to basically speed the whole process up. But of course comes to Jesus and finds that he's already dead. This is a key point in the Gospels, that Jesus dies not because if you read John's Gospel, I used to ask my students this when I taught in seminary, how does Jesus die in John's Gospel? And everybody wants to go, crucifixion. If you actually read John's Gospel, Jesus dies because he gives up his spirit,
right.
Because the Son of Man, as Jesus says, decides when that sort of thing happens. So it's like kind of miraculous kind of thing going on. And the soldier himself is surprised to find Jesus dead already. Hence, he kind of stabs him, and you get this kind of prophetic fulfillment. So what you have going on with the cross is this kind of battle of wills between you and your will to survive in that sense. Now, what's really fascinating in that is just jumping that into our kind of modern context, Tyson. If you jump over to a text like Galatians, what you're going to find, you knew we'd eventually end up in Galatians.
I knew we would get here.
Just think about what what Paul does here, right? So in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19, Paul now let's hold what we remember all the way back at the start in 1 Corinthians 1. Paul talks about how the cross changes the way we see everything, right? So Paul then says, actually, if you're led by the Spirit, then kind of do what the Spirit wants you to do. And then he lists some kind of things which are anti-Spirit of God. So he says sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I love this list from Paul, by the way, because it's kind of great preacher's rhetoric. It's like, bad things you can do are obvious. And he's saying witchcraft. And you can imagine the people going, oh, yeah, that's bad. And idolatry, oh, yes, definitely bad. Rage, yes. And then he says, selfishness. Oh, man.
Yeah.
Envy, and it's like starts with all this stuff that everybody can get on board with. That's definitely bad. And then he says selfishness. And you're like, oh no, we may have a problem, Houston. So then he says, I warn you that living like this doesn't bring you into the kingdom of God. Then he says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against these things there is no law. And then he says this, those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and its desires. And I think it's a fascinating little piece there that if you've seen or studied a crucifixion, remember this point. Why do you crucify something? Not to kill it, but essentially to let it die, right? So crucifixion isn't an execution device, it's a torture device. So it's fascinating that when Paul comes to say all of that stuff that you do, which is wrong, right? The stuff that's getting you in trouble, what do you do with that stuff? He doesn't say kill it, right? Which, of course, because you can't, right? That's the human problem. We've tried all that our whole lives. It's not proving very successful. You are, of course, now free from the power of sin because of Jesus' cross. Paul says, what do you do with all this stuff? He says, crucify it, right? Now, I think the metaphor that Paul's doing there, everybody he's writing to has seen a crucifixion, right? What do you do with the person that's crucified? Just leave them alone. Right? It's horrible, it's hard, it's difficult, but the kindest and best thing to do is just let them die, right? But every time you give them a bit of wine vinegar on that sponge, and every time you feed them a bit of food on a stick, what you do is you just give them enough power to keep fighting, to keep staying alive until their inevitable death. Now think about what Paul does in his theology of the cross then. He says, what about all this stuff you do? Selfishness, envy, witchcraft, idolatry, sexual immorality, right? Its days are numbered, right? If the cross has ultimately conquered the power of sin, all of this crud that we do in our lives, it's not going to be like that forever. God is going to put everything right in the end. We know that because of the cross and the resurrection. So what do you do with all of this stuff that you're currently got? Well, Paul just says, well, if you keep feeding it, it just keeps fighting, right? It just keeps getting stronger. It just keeps trying to stay there. So just let it die. Crucify it. Just let it suffer its way out, right? And I think it's a phenomenal metaphor to understand that God isn't calling you to battle with all the wrong stuff he's doing. All that God's actually asking of you is just stop feeding it, right? You just stop giving it that little bit of encouragement that it needs just to keep fighting a little bit longer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you only get to that understanding of it when you start to view crucifixion differently, as you're saying. Because it's so easy if you think the crucifixion is just about death. When you hear, Paul use the language of the flesh being crucified, you think of everything's got to get put to death immediately, and that's the process that I have to go, and it's this constant battle of putting it to death right away, because that comes from our understanding of what the crucifixion is about. But when you shift the thinking to now say, actually, it's a torture device, that's how they used it, and death is inevitable, and you just got to let stuff die, it takes on a new meaning within how you process things, how you actually begin to battle things, how to use a church word, what your sanctification actually begins to look like. And that's it's a long process, because as we read Paul, I'm not sure he's suggesting that it may be done in a year, right? Like, and and there's a guy, his name is Rob Reimer, and he's always used the language of your sanctification takes your entire life plus a day, meaning like the letting it die process probably is a lifelong thing of not feeding. But I think that actually brings, I would hope in some senses, some encouragement into how we process it, what the cross is doing, what that means for us, and really how we can respond to the stuff, as Paul's saying in there, the crud of our life, the stuff that shouldn't be there, and gives us a way to actually begin to move that forward. Because to look at everything that's wrong with my life and say, well, I just need to kill it all, that's a daunting task.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
To say, I need to spend my life making sure I'm not feeding these things, because we know that there's a time and place where it does have a shelf life. So I need to spend my time making sure I'm focusing on the right things, the fruit of the Spirit and what that looks like, and not feeding this. Well, now I've got a completely different approach to how I follow Jesus and respond to the cross.
Yes, and so I would add to that, and the key thing is make sure that when you're thinking like that, you get the order of things correct, right? Sure. So yes, I agree with you. Sanctification is a long process, but what is the process, right? So this is important. I think this is important anyway. Is the process that I start at point 0, and every time I shed some of this, every time something crucified dies, I move forward a step, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I'm suspicious of that model. It's the model I hear very, very often, right? I think that actually what happens is you've been given everything, right at the very start. Yeah. The problem is you keep going. So you start at 100. The problem is we then go, let's do 99, 98, 97, right? Because we keep feeding this other stuff, right? Yeah. So Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 15 about how inwardly we're renewed, but outwardly we're wasting away. It's like, so I don't believe... when I say this, I don't believe God has anything left to give you. Like, I think you get it all. The question is, do we take it, right? It's all there, but do we live in it? So, and for me, this is one of the things that's fascinating about Jesus, is one of the big problems with Jesus and Christianity, in my view, if properly understood, is what are you actually going to do with your time, right? So the classic religious model is... you find God, so you have some sort of enlightenment, which tells you that this is the true God, or this is the God you're going to believe in, right? And then what happens is you then encounter a series of rules, right? So it's like, so now that you've found the God, here's how you impress the God. Here's how you keep the God happy. And if you do all of this stuff throughout your life, if when you die, you've kind of got all of it together, cha-ching, you get glory, nirvana, whatever the term is. Yeah. Then you read the Bible, and it says, oh, you get that straight away, right? So, you ask some religions, well, where are you with God? And it's like, well, I hope that if I keep doing this, and if I keep holding this, and if I do this for my whole life, then I'll get this from God at the end. Christianity says, all of this is yours, right? It's Paul's word to the Corinthians. Like, don't you realize, he says to the Corinthians, that everything is yours, right? It's all given to you at the start. You become a Christian. Day one that you become a Christian, you realize, now in truth it was even true before that, right? You realize God loves you, and he will never love you more or less than he does at this exact moment. You are absolutely loved. So all of the stuff you do doesn't get you one step closer to him, right? Doesn't make you any different from him. You can run away, but you can't get anything more. It's there. Which actually, ironically enough, what I would often say about Christianity is all of its beginnings are where Christianity begins, where so many other, in terms of Christianity, let me talk about it like this, because Christianity has become so blurry for so many of us around the world. The call that Jesus placed in our life, the kingdom that Paul talks about in his Gospels, where it begins is where every other religion ends, right? So for so many religions, you are essentially so busy trying to keep yourself right with God that you can't do anything else. And the problem with Christianity for many of us is, it's all been done, right? It's why Christianity is fundamentally a missional organization, because it's like, well, what are you going to do with your time, right? Now, what a lot of us have chose to do is pretend that we've got a lot of stuff to do to keep God happy, right? But so what I would say is, yes, there is a sanctification journey, 100% there is, but part of the journey is me living in grace. Part of the journey is, I preached a sermon last summer where I simply asked the question, what if grace is the difficult thing? Like, we assume that Jesus is going to actually ask us to do something really, really hard in order to earn our salvation. What if the difficult thing that Jesus asks us to do is to realize that we don't have to work really, really hard to earn our salvation, and we just are completely resistant to believing that? So for me, like, I agree with what you're saying, is that there's this journey, and it's about letting these things die, but knowing that these things are not keeping us from God.
Yeah,
these
that's a
things
really
are
good point.
trying to drag us away from God.
Yeah.
You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and that's a good understanding, and again, a healthier understanding and thought process, even around a term like sanctification. A lot of times, the language of sanctification is around this idea of, well, it's me becoming more like Jesus, and which it is, but oftentimes we interpret that, as you were saying, of me starting at 0 and becoming more like Jesus by moving step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 all the way up.
100%.
Instead of, and because I would agree with what you're saying, when we look at what's happening and the grace of Jesus and what's happening at the cross, and you trust Jesus, you're right. You start at 100, if we're going to talk about levels, and assuming level 100 is the top level that you can, quote unquote, achieve. But I think that's a healthier understanding that, again, relieves so much stress.
Yeah.
If we're willing to embrace it. And I would agree, grace is hard to live in.
Yeah.
Because the world doesn't work like that, or like to work like that. And we don't like to work like that, in fairness.
No.
We like to say, I've earned it. I worked for it.
Yeah.
I'm proud, right? Like, so for us to say...
I just turned to this text here, Galatians 3, just go a couple of chapters earlier. Paul says this. He said, "Are you so foolish?" Let's go back to these. He doesn't use the term moron here, though. You've got a different term at this point. "Are you so unknowing?" is actually kind of what he is. After beginning by the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by the flesh? So it's essentially exactly what you're saying there. It's like, you've been given it all.
Yeah.
Why are you now trying to create a new system to get there, which you were already there? You know. So for me, it's not that we cause ourselves problems getting to sanctification. It's that, having been given sanctification, we blow it up on a pretty regular basis, but we don't blow it up the way that we think we do.
Right.
We think we blow it up by doing dumb stuff. I think we blow it off often by assuming that, having done dumb stuff, we now need to figure our way to earn our way back to God. And that's where we get ourselves in trouble, But, just continue with what you're saying. Go right back to where we started. Like, I love the start of 1 Corinthians. We talked about this, we were at the 1 Corinthians at the start of this piece. Paul writes to them, and this is what he says: "To the church of God in Corinth, to those sanctified." So there's that word again. Quite literally, the Greek word is made holy. It's the same word where we get the word saint from in the modern term. So when the word saint is just the Latin translation of the word holy, which we translate as sanctified, right? So to the church of God in Corinth, you might translate it, some translations do, to the saints, or those sanctified, to those made holy in Jesus and called to be his saints, or called to be his holy people. So that's Paul's intro to the church. You're a couple of pages in, Paul's like, okay, so to the saints in Corinth, here's some stuff we need to talk about, right? But bear in mind, this is all covered under the heading, "To the saints in Corinth." Paul's like, one of you is sleeping with his stepmother, right? And that's really wrong, okay? A group of you are so wealthy that you're coming to the communion table and drinking loads that when people that actually need food arrive, there's nothing left for them, and those people are dying, right?
Yeah.
And, and it's like, and all of this is under the heading, "The sanctified people in Corinth." So for me, if that's true, and that's the Bible, so I'm going to argue that that's where I want my authority to come from.
Yeah.
Whatever sanctification means, the people in Corinth were sanctified. Okay.
Even the one sleeping with his
even the one sleeping with his stepmother.
His stepmom,
right? Yeah. So you get what I'm saying? So I'm not trying to be controversial, but for me, how we do biblical theology is we take what the text is giving to us and go, well, whatever that means, it also has to mean this, right?
Yeah.
Which is why I've come to the conclusion that Christian theology is always retrospective, right? You begin at the start and then you figure out what you've been rescued from and what you've been kind of brought out to. Does that sort of follow? So that's where I love this piece in Galatians chapter 5 then, of reminding us that the cross is, again, it's the foolishness of the world and the wisdom of God. It's showing us a different way of how things work. And how do I deal with the wrong stuff that I am tempted to do all the time? Just let it die. Stop feeding it, stop keeping it alive, which in some cases simply just stop doing it. Because actually it's in the doing of that stuff that we start to realize how much we like. Envy is the reason it happens all the time is because envy feels good.
Right.
It feels good to judge your friend for what they've got and you don't have, and you can then decide that the problem is it's probably because he's cheating on his taxes, or it's probably because he's got tons of debt, or you know what I mean, or and so there's an attractiveness to basically putting the sponge on a stick and keeping your friend alive a little more. But the interesting thing is when you're trying to keep the person alive on the cross, you're doing it for selfish reasons, because the kind thing for them is to let them expire. Because is that making sense? So this is this power. Now, second thing that's going on in the cross, which is really important in all of that, is that the reason, and you mentioned it right at the start of this part of the discussion, it's done outside the city, right? And that's significant, right? Because you don't crucify somebody round the back. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You do it outside the city because you want everybody that comes to the city to see this is what happens if you mess with us, right? It's the Romans' way of saying you want to run away slaves. If you get caught, well, this is what happens, right? You want to start an insurrection? Go ahead. But look at what happens to it's almost like the Romans saying, if you want to start an insurrection, that's fine, but you better win, right? And and there's a lot of us, and we're just going to keep coming.
Yeah, we're currently undefeated.
Yes, exactly. So like by the time you've arrived in the Roman city, your stomach's gone. Because bear in mind, when we talk about the Roman Empire, we're not talking about one big country. Essentially, the Roman Empire is a network of cities. Right? So you could have a Roman city, like there could be a bunch of barbarians just 20 miles up the road. They just don't cause the Romans any problems because they're terrified of them. But we think in the modern world very much in countries. So if the Romans would conquer France, and we even teach it like this in school, then the Romans conquered France, then they conquered England. They never conquered Scotland. I just need to make that point right now. But the Scots were so nuts they built a wall and just said, "You guys keep the north. We're not going there anymore. Plus it's cold." And they didn't really conquer France. They just conquered all of the major city-states in France, and therefore they essentially owned. And most of the cities are built on the trade routes, right? Which of course is fascinating because what Paul does as an evangelist is he navigates all of those trade routes, because then if you basically go to a trade route and spread the gospel, it kind of spreads out into the villages and surrounding towns through trade and that sort of sense. So there was a lot of interesting strategy going on there from Paul. But yeah, you basically want to basically take the stomach of anybody who's walking into your city that don't mess with us. And they did this by the mechanism of humiliation, and then let's use that word again that's important, of shame, right?
Yeah.
So the cross was about shaming your enemies, and it was about it robbed them of any honor that they had. It robbed them of any sort of sense of prestige, of social standing. It was all gone, and it was taken from your family as well. You now became the family of that guy that got crucified,
right?
And in an ancient context, and I would say, we have kind of tried to transition in the Western world out of an honor and shame culture into a sort of guilt and innocence culture. But if you go to places in other parts of the world outside the kind of English-speaking world, you'll see notions of shame still being quite, the Middle East, the Far East, these sort of parts, which I know are not the best descriptors of these sort of areas, but, shame is still a very common driving force of somebody's culture. I can't do that because it'll bring shame to my family. I can't engage with this, or I can't engage with that, or I will do this because it brings honor to my family. But we still have it, right? The Olympics are a really interesting example of how honor still drives us in our contemporary culture. They are a Greek games, which were Dio Chrysostom, who was a writer around the time of Paul. He says once about kind of Olympian type characters. He says it's fascinating how brave somebody will be in a ring, right? Even a gladiator will go to war and to death in a ring as long as there's spectators. He says,
Right.
he says, but Dio Chrysostom says, but if there's nobody there, you won't find a brave man in 100 miles, right? And what he's saying is it's because of honor. It's like, well, yeah, but I'll get a name for myself. I'll get prestige from that. Well, the cross was designed. So in a culture that thinks like that, the cross was designed to essentially rob all of that from you. So what's fascinating, let's hold in mind Paul's introduction in 1 Corinthians about foolishness of the world, wisdom of God. What's fascinating is that the early Christians, they took the cross, designed as a mechanism of shame, and did exactly the opposite of it. Paul in Galatians chapter 6 talks about he boasts in the cross. So instead of perceiving the cross as a place of shame, Paul perceives it as actually honorable. Right? He says, this is the thing I'm actually going to boast in. Think about Paul, if the powers knew what they were doing, they would never have crucified Jesus. Now, what does Paul mean to boast in the cross? We could sort of say, oh, well, that means that he's just proud of what Jesus has done in the cross. But the only reason we say that is because we don't really get our heads around honor and shame cultures. So you've got to understand, imagine you came around to my house and I said to you, hey, I got to show you the richest guy in this part of town because I found him. Just jump in the car and we'll go and look at the richest guy in the town. So we jump in our car and we drive around a few streets and we drive to a highway bridge and we drive under the bridge and there's a guy sat under the bridge, with a shopping cart full of cans, and a sign saying, please help. And I said to you, that's the richest guy in this part of the town, right? Like that would be really hard for you and me to compute if we would go, I don't understand how you can say that.
Right.
Because our entire value system from our earliest part of our life has told us that's not what the richest person in town should look like. So when Paul says, I boast in the cross, when you hear that as a Greek speaker in the, if you're in Galatia, southern modern day Turkey in the first century, and somebody says, do you want to tell you what I'm proud of? Do you know what I'm going to boast about? What's honorable is the cross. That's like you and me looking at this homeless person and saying that's the richest person. You go, no, that doesn't work. For that to make sense, you would have to completely restructure my entire worldview on value. Right. And I think that's exactly what Paul is doing with the cross. So it's not that everything you know is okay. And this is where I think the honor and shame paradigm helps us understand the revolution of the cross, is that if the cross is something to boast in, then what that means is everything that you think about value is probably wrong, right?
Right.
Because the cross was fundamentally designed by the Romans to be the most dishonorable thing that could happen to a person. But Paul says, no, that's the peak. That's the thing. In fact, I'm crucified with Christ.
Yeah.
So the only way to do that is to completely invert the entire understanding of right and wrong, even in that world, the entire understanding of what's valuable and what's not valuable. And all of a sudden, things which are shameful are now honorable. By dint of that, things which are honorable are now shameful. Right. So, and you see that throughout the whole of the New Testament, right? A rich man comes to follow Jesus. Jesus says, hey, tell you what, if you gave up all that money, then you could come and follow me. Whoa, worldview clash, right? That doesn't work. That doesn't make sense, right? In Paul's world, it was highly socially stratified. So, people were all in all of their classes, right? Here's the rich up here, the middles, the down, right the way down. And even, again, let's go back to Dio Chrysostom writing at the time of Paul. Chrysostom says, he writes a lot about honor and shame. He's quite a critique of the system in that sense. He says, what's fascinating is even when you go down to the lowest of the low, lifelong slaves, what you realize is they categorize themselves. So the slaves that serve food consider themselves better than the slaves that clean toilets, right?
Right.
So Chrysostom says, there's something about us as humans that we put ourselves into categories and values, right?
Right.
And even amongst the lowest category of society, we subcategorize ourselves in that sort of context, right? So the cross is a wisdom which changes everything. So think about this. What is one of the ways the early Christians didn't hang crosses around themselves? The moment actually from the passion narrative that the early Christians took really hold of was the Last Supper, right? That was the meal that they said, this is the symbol of the cross and the resurrection of Jesus we're going to take hold of. What's fascinating, again, in 1 Corinthians, is that they saw it as a love feast, it's described at some point. But you see, Paul says this. He says, some of you are coming early and you're eating too much food. and some people are therefore coming late and they're unable to eat food. Well, in Paul's context, the people that come early are the people that are wealthy enough to come early because they probably work for themselves, or they don't even work because they have enough, just wealth.
Yeah.
The people who come late are the people that are not in control of their own agency. So they're probably slaves, right? That they can only come to the church gathering once they've done everything they're able to do.
Yeah, they've been told you're done.
Yes. Yeah. Or you think about Jesus' parable, there's some workers that are hanging around till late in the day just trying to get a job, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to come late. They're also the people with the least money because they didn't get a day's wages, got an hour's wages, right? So they need the communion meal because that's what's going to keep them alive. That's what's going to keep them fed, right? In that sort of sense. And notice what Paul says. Some of them are not eating and have fallen asleep. Right? And we often read that as judgment, as, they've been judged by God and died. But actually, if you read Paul clearly, it seems like he's saying they just died because they didn't have enough food. So this meal is like this communion meal in Corinth. Paul basically says, you're no different from anybody else, right? The able people come and they do okay, and the disabled people come and they're ignored and died. Paul then offers them a new vision based on the cross that actually, here's what Paul says. By the way, if you've got enough food at home, eat at home. And then just come and enjoy the service so that the people that can't eat can have more. And then in Greco-Roman culture, that's shocking language. That's not how it works, right? I mean, imagine you turn up at a gig and you've paid for VIP tickets and they put you at the back, right? And then the person that got the kind of last minute sort of deal on ticket exchange ends up on a front row seat for $10. You're like, that's not how it works, right? That's not how it's supposed to be. Paul upturns the whole system. Right? Now, here's what's fascinating is he says equal, and we know this from research that's gone on. There was a problem. The Christians were perceived as problematic because around the communion meal, men and women were treated equally, different social categories were treated equally, slaves and free people were treated equally, and there was definitely some problems in the early church about Jews and Gentiles being treated equally. Can you remember what I think is fascinating about this is what's the language that they use about the communion meal? So, and we say it every single day whenever we take communion in the contemporary church. This is the first bit that we can almost remember. I received from the Lord what I also pass on to you. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. He said, "This is my body broken for you."
Yeah.
And at the same, then after doing this, he took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." And as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.
Yeah.
Right? And that bit there, I think we miss that, right? You proclaim the Lord's death. In this upside down table, where rich are treated equally with poor, where women are treated equally with men, where slaves are equal with free, where Gentiles are equal with Jews, this is proclaiming the death of Jesus, the cross. This is what it looks like, right? Because it inverts the wisdom of the world. The world's logic becomes foolishness, and the world's foolishness becomes wisdom, right? So what was honorable becomes shameful, right? What was shameful becomes honorable, right? In that sense. So you're poor, you don't eat. Well, in the Christian church, you're poor, you do eat, right? It's all been inverted. So there's something really powerful about the Christians realizing that it's not simply that Jesus died. The manner of his death is significant also. It's the fact that he died on a cross, right? And the fact that he died on a cross means that it's more than just a death, right? That Jesus is inverting and turning upside down the way that we think about life, right? And right down to how we think about the things that we value, how we think about the things that we think are important in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, there's so much that you're touching on that it's going to take me 3 days to process, and sort all of this, but it's all good and it's all helpful and it's all things that I think,
Well, and there's an earthiness to it. This is what you always want to get from the cross, that Jesus actually resists kind of spirituality at some sort of level, and I probably need to quantify what I mean by that. But what we don't get is that Jesus died by somehow being taken up into heaven, or it's an earthy, dirty, bloody death in real dirt by real oppressors. In that sense, that Jesus comes in and he turns it all over. So for me, if you can kind of hold all of these ideas in your head about the social implications, Jesus is a rebel, but he's not a rebel against Rome directly. He's a rebel against everything. The cross being announced as the honorable moment, the place of boasting, right?
Yeah.
The place of glory. If the cross is a place of glory, then Jesus has revolutionized the way that we see the world. And that happened like amongst us. So the reason I bring up the communion thing is that what I'm saying is that what you see on the cross, you now see at the communion table. There's a beautiful question I love to ask myself on a regular basis is where else is the cross true? Right? Because if the cross is true, then it should be true in a lot of places. If we as Christians say, I believe in Jesus, right, and I believe that he died on the cross to deliver us, then where else is that deliverance happening in our lives, right? If the communion table models what it looks like to actually be, to actually live by the wisdom of God, not the wisdom of the world, where else could that be true? Is that true in how we lead our businesses, right? If you're a business leader, does your business structure reflect the communion table, or does it reflect the hierarchy of the world?
Yeah.
Right. If you're a pastor, does the way that you deal with your congregation reflect the communion table or the business structures of the world? You know what I mean? If you're, all these questions start kind of falling out, that this, where else is the cross true? And then, or perhaps even more important question, where else is the cross not true, that we are called as Jesus followers to make it true, to invert that wisdom of the way things are supposed to go, if you kind of track what I'm working with there.
Yeah.
So I think that there's there's still more that we can talk about here. But I think a couple of things that I want to kind of try and just join some dots, and then
perfect.
We'll probably just crash land this podcast and just give up because our voices have collapsed on us.
Well, yours more than mine, I think. But
so Karl Barth points out something which is really fascinating. If you dig out the creed, the Apostles' Creed, kind of famous creed of the Bible, one of the fascinating things about the Apostles' Creed is that Pontius Pilate gets a mention of it. So in this great statement of Christian doctrine, it's like Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And Bart's like, why does such a horrendous man get his name? He's the only human mentioned in the church's creed.
Yeah.
It's like Jesus and then later on Mary gets added, but Pilate got in there first. And Barth has this brilliant thing where he basically suggests that by mentioning Pontius Pilate, we always remember that the cross is something that happened in our life. It happened in our world. It's part of our history. It's not a purely spiritual event. It actually happened. So the early church fathers who put together this creed, whether intentionally or not, constantly remind us that the cross is a historical event. It's a historical event that works outside of time and history. Somehow you see this in the New Testament. The cross seems to work backwards and forwards. So we tend to think of the cross happened and everybody that comes after it is saved by the cross. But if you read Hebrews, for example, you realize that actually everybody that came after it and everybody that came before it, the cross isn't bound by time, but at the same time it happens in our history. It's something that really happened. So our theology and our history and our politics and our social life are all connected. This is the kind of fulcrum point where all of history turns at that sort of level. But of course, there is a level of which the cross then is a critique as well. The foolishness of the world versus the wisdom of God. So there is a point that the cross is a critique of Pilate. It is a critique of the Roman Empire. They tried to kill Jesus and that didn't work. Well, it did work, but not in the way they thought it was going to work. I always feel like it's a resurrection point, but Jesus breaks a Roman seal to leave to leave the temple, to leave the tomb. So there's a level of which there is a critique of Pilate. There is a critique of how that all works, which I think we've got to learn as Christians to kind of sit comfortably with that at some level, that the cross is problematic for us because of what we said right at the very start in 1 Corinthians 1:18, that it's inverting our notions and understanding of wisdom. And I don't want us to sort of jump past that without kind of just pointing out ultimately that's what we're trying to get across in this long conversation. Now, I think what the cross also does, which is important, is having sort of set up that sense of it's happening in our history. It also, I think I'd want to say it like this, it reminds us that this deliverance and this being set free that we talk about in the cross happens because of God's interaction in humanity's world, or in his world, but the world that we exist in. So again, unlike a lot of other kind of religious notions, generally speaking, the narrative of a lot of religion, and I think you see this in Christianity quite a lot as well, is the question is, how does broken humanity reach God, right? And you hear that question all the time, actually, particularly in spirituality circles, like, how do I get to God, right? And I think in certain forms of Christianity, that question is true of Christianity as well. How do I get to God? The cross, for me, why it's so important that we notice it as a historic event, and I would be kind of channeling a little bit of Philippians 2 in this sort of conversation, is the cross points out that the story of the New Testament, in fact, the story of the whole Bible, is never a story about how we get to God. It's a story about how God gets to us.
Right.
So there was an old tract years ago that used to be handed out in the hope that it would bring people to Jesus, and it painted a picture of two sides of a kind of ravine.
Yeah,
right?
Like a cliff.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
With a
The
gap
one
in
that
the
I'm
middle,
talking
right?
about. And there's
Yeah.
a gap in the middle, and there's a human on one side and God's on the other side. And essentially what would happen is the story was explained that the humans wanted to get to God, but they couldn't because of all of our sin. And our sin stopped us getting to God, which is, again, is problematic, because go back to the Old Testament, sins, the things that you do wrong, were never a problem for God.
Right.
Yet here in this painting or picture, the sins are the things stopping you get to God. And because there's this idea out there that God can't look at sin, right? And don't let me forget, we want to make a comment about that before we move on, right? But
Sure.
So what happens is the cross comes down into the gap and allows you, the human, to mooch your way over to get to God. Like, this is the religion that's not Christianity, right? Because actually what Christianity says is the problem, let's go right back to what is the problem that the cross is here to solve, right? The problem isn't that we can't get to God, it's that God wants to get to us, right? And it's our process that needs changed in that sense. So the cross comes into the story, not to allow us to get to God, but to allow God to get to us. And Jesus is that process of him getting to us. So very often, our whole way of teaching about Jesus is about us on a journey to get somewhere. And really what I want to, and I use the journey metaphor because we do like it, but all metaphors fail, remember, ultimately. I think a far more healthy thing is that if there is a journey, it's the journey of God to us. The best example of what humans do on a journey, I think, is in the Old Testament with the people of Israel. They leave Egypt and then spend 40 years walking in circles in the desert, just outside of where God's got for them. So the journey metaphor in Scripture about humans is always faulty, right? We are not on a journey towards God. God has come to us, and He is amongst us already in that sort of sense. So really brief comment. One of the things that happens with that is part of the reason why we get into this mess, and I think is again solved by the cross, is we come in this faulty notion that God struggles with sin more than he does, right? With our sins, rather, more than he does. The problem that God has, let's push the earlier metaphor. There's so many metaphors spinning in this podcast, Tyson. It's kind of just, I feel sorry for everybody. The Bible loves its metaphors, and if you spend a lot of time studying the Bible, I think you love having metaphors as well, and just you end up with so many there.
Sure.
Let's go back to, let's name the metaphor. Let's go back to...
Which metaphor?
The guy with the brain tumor, right? So now he gets into the surgeon who's actually going to fix the problem. And the surgeon says, here's the problem. We can take the tumor out. The problem is you'll die, right? Because once we take this tumor out, it's so big and it's made so much damage to your brain, you won't survive the surgery, right? Now, I think that metaphor is a really helpful metaphor of the problem that the cross solves, right? That humanity has become so infected by this anti-God power called sin that God's problem is he can destroy sin. Actually, like, sin's quite easy to destroy, right? You just kill it. Right. Paul says that the wages of sin, death. And once death happens, it's over. Right. The problem is you're dead. Right. So
we're all dead.
Everybody's dead.
Everyone is dead.
So the God's actual problem is, how does he destroy the sin without destroying his good creation?
Yeah.
Right? And so the cross is this profound piece of surgery. So now adding another metaphor, it's this profound piece of surgery that extracts the problem without destroying the creation. But we have this kind of weird notion somewhere that's developed that God himself can't see sin or look at sin or is blinded by sin. And I remember one of my professors saying to me once, if God can't see sin, what does he look at? Right? Because
fair shout.
Yeah, because it's everywhere. It's endemic, right? And that sometimes leaves us with some problems where we come to the cross and we see Jesus, and Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we explain this. I've seen this constantly explained as, well, this is because God turns his back on Jesus while he's on the cross.
Another worship song.
Yeah, the Father turns his face away. And is it the same song? It might be the same song as the one about my sins holding him there. Maybe it's just a bad song. I don't know.
I might have to do, while you finish this, I might just have to look and see.
And so I think this comes from a misunderstanding of how God works. And like, I definitely resonate with the idea that Jesus clearly is going through a profoundly difficult moment when he is on the cross, right? It's hard to see that. In fact, I love this quote by G.K. Chesterton, who said, when the world shook and the sun was wiped out of heaven, it was not at the crucifixion, but at the cry from the cross. The cry which confessed that God was forsaken of God. And now let the revolutionists choose a creed from all the creeds and a God from all the gods of the world, carefully weighing all the gods of inevitable reoccurrence and unalterable power. They will not find another God who has himself been in revolt. Nay, the matter grows too difficult for human speech. But let the atheists themselves choose a God. They will find only one divinity who ever uttered their isolation, and only one religion in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist. Right? So there's clearly this incredible moment where, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I think Jesus, as a human, this constant complexity of Jesus being both God and man, this sense of just feeling abandoned, I think is definitely evident in that story. You don't want to rule that out. We've got to be careful of inserting our own interpretation onto that's not textual. So we say, Jesus is abandoned because the Father can't look at Jesus while he's carrying the sins of the world. And therefore the Father turns his back on him. Now, I hope, and I've left this till very late in our podcast, just for the loyal few that are still with us. I hope that you've even got enough already from what we've said to hear the problems in that sort of statement. Number one, was Jesus dying for the sins of the world? So the Father turns his back on Jesus because Jesus is carrying all the sins of the world on the cross. Or would the Father abandon Jesus when Jesus is part of the Trinity's plan to destroy sin and deliver the world from evil, right? At the very key moment of the deliverance, does God bail out on that? And I think what you're actually seeing at this moment on the cross is the tension of Jesus' divinity and humanity clashing, where Jesus essentially feels the human distance from God. And, but to say that Jesus is actually abandoned by God, well, that would become hugely problematic if you think about it. Because if the Father is going to... Well, firstly, I've been using my language badly, forgive me. Is Jesus abandoned by the Father? Jesus is God, right? So how he could be abandoned by himself, and that's why I quite like... God was forsaken of God. Chesterton's trying to wrestle with this while admitting the words aren't working here, right? So let's talk about Father and Son. Does the Father turn his back on Jesus at the very point in which Jesus is doing the job that he was sent to do, right? If God the Father can do that to God the Son, how confident are you feeling right now about God's promises to never abandon you or leave you, right?
Totally.
Yeah, I'm feeling like, I'm
It
not...
makes me start to question. Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, Paul, when you say that Jesus will never leave us or forsake us, or in Romans 8, that nothing will separate us. But if the Father was willing to abandon the Son at the very point in which the Son was doing the very thing he was sent to do, I'm not sure. Right? Now, what's fascinating at that point, Tyson, in the whole story, is that my God, why have you forsaken me, is a psalm. It's the first line of a particular psalm. It's the first line of Psalm 22. And I think it's fascinating if anybody picks up their Old Testament and jumps to Psalm 22, all of a sudden you wonder if maybe something else is going on here, right? I think of the famous Christian hymn, Amazing Grace, right? And if I was telling you a story and I said, oh, and then we all sang Amazing Grace and went home, right? Would you think that the room was just a group of people saying the words Amazing Grace to a melodic tune? Or would the phrase, we sang Amazing Grace, tell you we sang the whole hymn? And because you grew up in church, you probably know a lot of that hymn, so you can even start to remember through your head what we were probably singing. The Psalms are the hymn book of Israel. When it says Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Maybe Jesus does just cry out those few words, or maybe he cries out the whole psalm. But I find it hard to believe that people standing nearby wouldn't recognize that's Psalm 22, right?
Yeah.
Now, then you go and read Psalm 22. What's interesting is Psalm 22 opens with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Do you know what else is in Psalm 22? They divided my garments amongst you, right? It starts tracking through all of this story. Now, in Hebrew poetry, in English-speaking poetry, we try to rhyme all of our lines together and make the big point at the end of the poem. In Hebrew poetry, it works what they call chiastically in the shape of an X. So the center point of the poem is often the point that you want to pay most attention to. What's interesting is the center point of Psalm 22, the question is raised, will the Lord turn his back or turn his face or turn away? Sorry, I should have it up right with me right now to quote directly. That's terrible from me. But the central point of Psalm 22 is essentially, will the Lord abandon his anointed one?
Right.
So to me, it's really interesting that, it's really interesting that the very psalm that Jesus sort of essentially quotes on the cross, or at least alludes to on the cross.
Yeah.
Here you go, Psalm 22, verse 24. For he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him. And it's very hard for me not to read Mark's. Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's really hard for me not to think that verse 24 isn't in Jesus' mind.
Right.
Now Psalm 22 is essentially, when you read the whole thing, it's essentially an apology for what appears to be God abandonment, right? So I feel like crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But as the psalm moves his way through, the psalmist starts to realize, or starts to announce, that might be what it looks like is going on here, but that's just not how God works.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we see that one verse from Jesus and go, oh, look, because of our model of the cross, we think Jesus is dealing with sins. God can't look at sins. God's turned his back on Jesus. But the very psalm that Jesus alludes to has the psalmist pointing out, God just can't do that. That's not how he works. He doesn't turn his back, on his anointed one, right? So I find that really quite fascinating. It's also really interesting that the final line of Psalm 22 is that he will proclaim deliverance to a people yet unborn. This is verse 31. Proclaim deliverance to a people yet unborn, saying that he has done it. Right? It's really interesting. If you jump over to John's gospel, the last thing that Jesus says before he dies is, it is finished, right? Or it is complete. And I there's a little bit of me, this is me pushing it just a tiny little bit, but I always, when I read Psalm 22, it's hard for me to not draw a connection between a deliverance for a people yet unborn, that's you and me, and an announcement that he has done it, and Jesus saying on the cross, it's complete. When we know that earlier on, Jesus has said in the cross, the first verse from that very psalm, and then also there's the verse in that psalm about the dividing up of his clothes. So it almost feels like Psalm 22 is becoming a kind of guiding psalm to interpreting this scene, which definitely isn't God abandonment. Rather more, it's appears like abandonment from God, when actually it's the very opposite. In that sense. And I feel like that to me is just really important to say, because I encounter people regularly who because of the way the cross has been introduced as God the Father turning his back on Jesus, I think it does subtly kind of root into us, maybe in our psychology somewhere, that God can do that sort of thing. And I think that's problematic. So I want to loop over then to Romans chapter 8 and remind us that when Paul says nothing separates us from the love of God, like he really means that, you know. So finally then, what do we say? We've used that word finally, so we now, the clock is ticking. We have to bring things to an end. The thing that I do want to mention, just as we sort of close this up, is that all of this does, we've alluded to this, but let's just put a little bit of legs on it. I think something you've made mention of already. All of this story of the cross leans us towards the shape of our own lives, right? So the cross is the means of our deliverance. It's the means of our atonement. It's also the method of our atonement. But it also is, and only you can say this after you've done the first three, through the Holy Spirit, it's the model of Christian life as well. Michael Gorman's term cruciformity is the one that I think is really, really powerful at that point, that we are cross-shaped, you know, that we're that Christian theology, you use Martin Luther's term. Martin Luther said that what we often want is a theologia glory, the Latin term, a theology of glory. But what Jesus gives us is a theologia crucis, right? A theology of the cross. And if we don't sort of wrestle with that properly, we will constantly resist the sort of suffering and the sort of difficulty of following Jesus, because he is a wisdom of God, not a wisdom of the world. There's this great quote from Rutledge. She says this: teaching about the cross is very hard work. Maybe you're vibing with that right now. Teaching about the cross is very hard work. We see something of this in Paul's second letter to the Christians in Corinth, where Paul drains himself of every mental and emotional resource in hopes that their trust in the gospel will be renewed. Taking up the cross, as Jesus himself calls us to do, means a total reorientation of the self towards the way of Christ. Long before he knew his own destiny, Dietrich Bonhoeffer memorably wrote, "When Christ calls a person, he bids them come and die." And of course, Bonhoeffer is executed by the Nazis not that long after he writes those particular words. So this sense of what we are offered on the cross is also a model for, through the Spirit of God, how we're going to live out this alternate wisdom, which we started with way back in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. The cross offers us a different way of life. You know, you even think about it, that the cross is the story of the passion. Passion means suffering. We've talked about this just recently in our Sunday teachings. What are we called to do by Jesus? We're called to be compassionate, right? Well, compassion, literally compassion, is suffering with. Com means with, and passion is, so this word compassion actually means to suffer with. The cross is Jesus suffering with us, but the cross is a model of suffering with things. And to me, that is what pushes us towards this question. The text that you mentioned, and I know it's a favorite text of you and also of me, Galatians 2:20, I am crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. In fact, the life I now live in the body, I live by faith or by trust in the Son of God who loved me by dying for me. So Paul's like, my whole life is now shaped by what, essentially by what Jesus has done on the cross. And I think it's interesting how there's two ways to look at that. I think there's cruciform people all over the place. There's the call for us, I think, in our position of privilege, to look at how do we embrace cruciformity in our own lives. What does it look like for me as a kind of comfortable Westerner to think through how would the cross shape me? Right? How should the cross shape me? How should it form me into this wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world? But then on the other side, there's people that are in enforced cruciformity. James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, it basically talks about kind of the civil rights abuses in America and how you have generations of black people who are essentially being forced into cruciformity by lynchings and abuses, right, and public violence. there's all sorts of parts of colonial history that are doing the same thing. That cruciformity is everywhere. Some people are being enforced into it, and some people are wrestling with how to work it. And some people need rescued from their enforced cruciformity, and some people need to actually step into something to kind of reset the balance of the communion table, of equality around the table, which, remember, proclaims the Lord's death until he comes. Do you get what I'm kind of wrestling with about there? And so I kind of, I kind of want to almost leave things there in that sense. For me, wherever you go with the description of the cross, and this has been a long conversation about the cross, you want to end up probably in Galatians 2, and I wonder if that's maybe part of the reason why it's such an interesting verse for you in your own life, is that you always want to end up there at that point of saying, well, how is this shaping me then? And if all you do is say, well, it shapes me because I know what happens when I die, you've sold yourself short, right? But if you never think about what the cross does into your eternal future, you've sold yourself short there as well. The cross, something that happens in this world and somehow spiritually in the whole cosmos as well. I don't know if you want to jump in and add anything on that point.
No, it's this conversation is just, they're fun for me, period. And I get the privilege of having lots of these with you off microphone and record and camera and everything else here. And your insight into this is just, it's so helpful. And I think how you've explained it is in a real palatable way that allows, people, regardless of their upbringing, church, no church, whatever that looks like, to be able to say, well, I feel like I can start to make sense of some of this. And obviously there's way more that can be said. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's 4 other books on this desk you haven't even cracked open yet that I'm assuming have...
Well, I've alluded to them.
Yeah. But, and that's really what I appreciate about this conversation, and just about your wisdom in it, is just this... the ease of kind of an entry point to it, to say, yes, we have covered a lot. Yes, we need to consider a lot of different pieces. But at the end of the day, it's this coming back to, and what does it now mean for me? But I think you've presented it in a way that, makes it, certain foods are easier to eat and digest than others. This is a very hearty meal. Yeah. As far as what you're trying to digest, but I think really helpful.
I think that I am condemning myself to an evening where I'm going to spend the rest of the night in a cold sweat going, and I should have spoke about that. And I say that not to sound arrogant. I mean to say keep scratching at this, because if the cross is the test that proves everything, if where we started, Luther's, then everything needs to be brought through this lens. Like the cross is the glasses that you put on, and now I'm going to see the world through this in everything. How I treat everybody, how I behave, literally, I don't think there's anything, because bear in mind what Paul says, he says the whole wisdom of the world has now been shown to be foolish. So if the thinking that you have isn't cross-based thinking, if your thinking isn't cruciform, Paul's point is possibly foolish. In fact, maybe Paul would say probably foolish. Paul might even say definitely foolish, right? And he's a long way from us, so he doesn't need to be so careful with his words.
Because he might even use the word moron. So.
I think I love this. Let me end with a couple of paragraphs then. I love this towards the end, well, actually, the very end of her book on the crucifixion.
Fleming Rutledge.
Fleming Rutledge says this. She says, forgiveness is not enough. Belief in redemption is not enough. Wishful thinking about the intrinsic goodness of every human being is not enough. Inclusion is not a sufficiently inclusive message, nor does it deliver real justice. There are some things, many things, that must be condemned and set right if we are to proclaim a God of both justice and mercy. And then this is a line I love. Only a power independent of this world order can overcome the grip of the enemy of God's purpose for his creation. Jesus Christ, and then she quotes Hebrews 1:2, the heir of all things, offered himself up to be the condemned and rejected righteous one. Derelict, outcast, and God-forsaken, he hung there as the representative of all humanity and suffered condemnation in the place of all humanity to break the power of sin and death over all humanity. And like I love that kind of summary of it. And she goes on then to say essentially what we've said, that we then have to live now in this Galatians 2:20. I'm crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And she concludes then with this old 1700s Easter hymn that I'm going to read, and we'll put this as our conclusion of our time together. It says simply this: "Awake, arise, lift up your voice. Let Easter music swell. Rejoice in Christ, again rejoice, and on his praises dwell. Oh, with what gladness and surprise the saints their Savior greet. Nor will they trust their ears and eyes, but by his hands and feet. Those hands of liberal love indeed, in infinite degree. Those feet still free to move and bleed, for millions and for me."